Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Deacon Woolridge had been running the I-80 corridor for 12 winters, and he knew Donner Pass the way a man knows the scar on his own knuckle. Every blind curve, every grade percentage, every chain-up area between Cisco Grove and the Nevada line was burned into his memory like a route map written in diesel smoke. February 2024 brought the kind of storm that turned the Sierra into a white wall, the kind that made dispatchers go quiet on the phone when you told them you were still rolling. Deacon had left Sacramento at 9 p.m. with a full load of electronics bound for Reno, figuring he'd beat the worst of it. By the time he hit Emigrant Gap, the snow was coming down sideways, and CHP had the chains-required signs lit up like Christmas. He pulled into the designated chain-up area at Nyack, just past the Donner Summit rest area. The lot was a chaos of red brake lights cutting through the storm, maybe 8 rigs scattered across the gravel and packed snow, drivers hunched against the wind as they wrestled with cold steel links. Deacon backed into an open spot near the far edge, killed his running lights except for the flashers, and climbed down into the bite of mountain wind. His breath came out in clouds thick enough to hide his hands. The load was tight on his hours of service. He'd calculated it down to the minute. 22 minutes to chain up, another hour and 10 over the pass if the road stayed open. Then he'd have just enough time to make his delivery window at the Sparks Distribution Center before his 14-hour clock ran out. He was halfway through securing the second set of chains when a wrecker rolled in from the westbound lane, engine growling low. Amber lights spinning lazy circles across the snow. It came to a stop 30 feet from Deacon's rig, and the driver stepped out. Tall, heavy coat, ball cap pulled low. He didn't approach Deacon directly. Instead, he walked between the parked trucks like he was inspecting them, shining a handheld spotlight at trailer doors and looking at placards. Deacon kept working, but his hand slowed. Something about the way the man moved felt deliberate, like he was taking inventory instead of offering help. The wrecker had no CHP escort, no Caltrans markings, just a faded decal on the door that Deacon couldn't read through the snow. When the man finally turned toward him, he called out over the wind with a voice that carried too easily for the conditions. "You hauling anything temperature-sensitive?" the man asked, still 20 feet away. Deacon straightened up, chain tool still in his gloved hand. "Why?" he said, not hostile, just careful. The man took a few steps closer, close enough now that Deacon could see his face under the brim of his cap. Weathered, older, the kind of face that could have belonged to any roadside mechanic between here and Omaha. "Name's Luther Pritchard," the man said. "Independent contractor. CHP's been asking us to check loads in weather like this. Make sure seals are intact. No cargo shift, no leaks. Safety protocol." Deacon didn't answer right away. He'd been through Donner and storms worse than this, and he'd never once seen a wrecker driver ask about seals unless there was an accident or a CHP directive with paperwork to match. "I didn't get any message from dispatch about inspections," Deacon said, keeping his tone even. Luther nodded like he'd expected that. "They're running it quiet tonight. Too many rigs stacking up. If we broadcast it on CB, we'd have a bigger jam than we already do." He gestured back toward his wrecker. "I've got the authorization if you want to see it. Just doing my job, brother. Helping keep the pass clear." Deacon looked past him toward the other trucks. A few drivers were finishing up their chains. One guy was leaning against his cab smoking, steam rising from his thermos. Nobody else seemed to be getting approached. That was the detail that stuck in Deacon's mind like a splinter. If this was CHP protocol, why was Luther only talking to him? "I'll radio CHP myself," Deacon said, reaching for his CB mic through the open door. "Appreciate the concern, but my seals are good and my load's secure." Luther's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He didn't step back, didn't nod, and walk away like a man who'd been politely declined. Instead, he stayed planted in the snow, hands in his pockets, watching Deacon like he was waiting for something. "Suit yourself," Luther said finally. "But if your seals break on the grade and CHP finds out you refused an inspection, that's on your record, not mine." He turned and walked back toward his wrecker without another word, boots crunching through the snow in a rhythm that felt too casual for a man who'd just been brushed off. Deacon climbed back into his cab and grabbed the CB mic, fingers stiff from the cold. He keyed up on Channel 19, the trucker frequency. "Any CHP or Caltrans monitoring eastbound Donner. This is a westbound rig at the Nyack chain-up looking for confirmation on roadside inspections. Anybody copy?" Static hissed back at him. He tried again on Channel 9, the emergency band. Still nothing. He switched to his cell phone. One bar, flickering. He pulled up the CHP non-emergency number and let it ring. It went to voicemail. "You've reached the California Highway Patrol, Truckee Area office. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, leave a message." Deacon ended the call without leaving one. Through his windshield, he could see Luther's wrecker idling near the exit ramp, exhaust mixing with the snow. The amber lights were still turning, but slower now, like the vehicle was settling into wait. Deacon's gut told him two things. First, Luther wasn't CHP, wasn't Caltrans, and wasn't doing safety checks. Second, leaving this chain-up area was about to get a lot more complicated than he'd planned. He finished securing his chains in silence, double-checking every link, every tensioner, every connection point. When he was done, he didn't stow his tools right away. He kept the chain binder in the cab, within reach, and made sure his doors were locked before he climbed back in. The CB crackled to life. A voice came through, scratchy and distant, but clear enough. "Eastbound at Nyack. This is a rig 2 miles ahead of you at Rainbow Bridge. You asking about inspections?" Deacon grabbed the mic. "Yeah. Wrecker driver here says CHP's running safety checks on loads. You heard anything about that?" A pause, then the voice came back, quieter this time. "Negative. I just cleared a CHP checkpoint at Truckee. They didn't say a word about inspections. Only thing they're checking is chains and HOS logs. Who approached you?" Deacon looked out at Luther's wrecker. It was rolling now, slow, cutting across the lot toward the ramp that led back onto I-80 eastbound. Wrecker called himself Luther Pritchard, independent contractor, he said. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried a different weight. "Listen close, driver. Don't follow that wrecker. Don't take any detour he offers you. If he tries to block your lane, you call 911 and you stay put with other rigs around you. There's been talk on the CB the last 2 weeks about trucks getting flagged off the highway up here, loads going missing. CHP hasn't confirmed it, but the word is out. You copy?" Deacon's hand tightened on the mic. "I copy. Appreciate the heads up." He set the mic down and watched Luther's wrecker disappear into the curtain of snow, taillights fading like embers swallowed by ash. Deacon sat there in the idling warmth of his cab, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the snow. The chain-up area was emptying out now, one rig after another pulling back onto the highway. He had a choice. Roll east like planned and hope Luther had moved on. Or sit tight, burn his HOS clock, and miss his delivery window. Neither option felt clean. He reached for his logbook, flipped it open, and stared at the lines. 14 hours. He had maybe 90 minutes left before he'd be forced to shut down for 10. If he waited here another 30 minutes, the math wouldn't work. The load would be late, the receiver would be furious, and his safety rating would take a hit. But if Luther Pritchard was running some kind of scam, some kind of cargo theft operation using fake inspections and detours, then rolling out alone into the storm was exactly what the man wanted. Deacon made his decision. He fired up the engine, released the brakes, and rolled toward the exit. But instead of merging eastbound toward Nevada, he swung wide and headed west, back down the mountain toward the last truck stop he'd passed, the one at Emigrant Gap. It would cost him an hour, maybe more. It would kill his delivery window. But it would also put him in a lit lot with cameras, other drivers, and a landline to CHP that actually worked. As he descended the grade, he kept his eyes on the mirrors. No amber lights followed him. No wrecker appeared in his blind spots. Just snow, darkness, and the faint glow of his own trailer lights reflecting off the white. He thought about the way Luther had moved between the trucks, shining his light at placards, checking loads like a man making a shopping list. He thought about the question. You hauling anything temperature sensitive? Not, are you okay? Not, need help with your chains? But a question designed to sort cargo, to identify value. Deacon didn't know if he'd just escaped something or avoided nothing at all, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't rolling over Donner Pass tonight. Not alone. Not in the dark, and not with Luther Pritchard anywhere on the same stretch of highway. The descent back down toward Emigrant Gap felt longer than Deacon remembered. The snow had thickened into something close to a whiteout, the kind where your headlights just bounce back at you and the lane markings disappear under a blanket of white. He kept his speed down to 35, both hands locked on the wheel, eyes straining to follow the reflective posts along the shoulder. Every few seconds he'd glance at his mirrors, half expecting to see amber lights cutting through the storm behind him. But there was nothing. Just the empty ribbon of highway and the muffled roar of his own engine grinding against the grade. His CB crackled intermittently with scattered trucker chatter, most of it complaints about chain requirements and closure rumors. Someone eastbound reported seeing a jackknifed rig near Donner Lake. Another voice warned about black ice forming under fresh powder past the summit. Deacon listened but didn't key up. He didn't want to broadcast his position, didn't want to announce he was rolling west when everyone else was pushing east. It felt paranoid, but paranoia had kept him out of trouble more than once on this job. When you've been driving long enough, you learn that the gut feeling you ignore is usually the one that costs you. The Emigrant Gap truck stop appeared through the snow like a mirage made of neon and diesel fumes. It wasn't big, maybe a dozen parking spots and a squat building with a diner attached, but every space was full and the lights were blazing. Deacon had to circle twice before a spot opened up near the back fence, tucked between a refrigerated trailer and an older Peterbilt with Nebraska plates. He backed in carefully, set his brakes, and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the adrenaline drain out of his shoulders. His hands were sore from gripping the wheel. His jaw ached from clenching his teeth. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been until the silence settled around him. He grabbed his phone. Still one bar, but it was enough. He pulled up the CHP number again, and this time it rang through. A dispatcher answered on the third ring, her voice flat with the kind of exhaustion that comes from working graveyard shifts in a storm. Highway Patrol, what's your location and nature of the call? Deacon gave her the details. His name, his truck number, the chain-up area at Nyack, and Luther Pritchard's approach. He described the wrecker, the questions about cargo, the lack of any CHP markings or paperwork. The dispatcher asked him to hold, and he heard keys clicking in the background as she pulled up records. When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted. Not alarmed, but more focused. "Mr. Woolridge, we don't have any independent contractors authorized for inspections on Donner Pass tonight. We've had reports over the last month about a wrecker operating in that area during storms, approaching drivers under false pretenses. We haven't been able to confirm a pattern yet, but your report matches what we've heard. Did this individual attempt to redirect you off the highway or request access to your trailer?" Deacon told her no, that he'd refused and driven back down the mountain. She made a note of it, asked for a description of Luther Pritchard, and told him an officer would follow up if they located the wrecker. Then she added something that made Deacon's stomach tighten. "If you're planning to continue east tonight, I'd recommend traveling in a convoy if possible. We've had 2 incidents in the past 3 weeks where drivers reported being followed after leaving chain-up areas. One driver said a wrecker tried to box him in near the Rainbow Bridge turnout. He managed to get past it, but we never found the vehicle. Stay in communication with other drivers on your CB, and if you see that wrecker again, do not stop. Call 911 immediately." Deacon thanked her and ended the call. He sat in the dim glow of his cab, staring at the phone in his hand. 2 incidents. Followed. Boxed in. He thought about the way Luther had waited at the edge of the chain-up area, engine idling, like a predator watching the herd to see which animal would stray. He climbed out of the cab and walked towards the diner, boots crunching through the snow. The cold hit him like a fist, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head. Inside, the diner was packed with drivers hunched over coffee and plates of eggs that had been sitting under heat lamps too long. The air smelled like grease, burnt coffee, and wet coats drying too close to space heaters. Deacon found a stool at the counter and ordered black coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been on her feet for 10 hours straight. While he waited, he scanned the room. Most of the faces were familiar in the way all trucker faces were familiar. Weathered, tired, eyes that had seen too many miles and too many close calls. A woman in a reflective vest sat 2 stools down, nursing a cup of soup. She had the look of someone who worked nights, the kind of pallor you only get from years of graveyard shifts. Deacon caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. "You just come down from the pass?" she asked. Her voice was rough, like she'd been breathing cold air and cigarette smoke in equal measure. Deacon confirmed he had. "Turned back at Nyack. Got a weird vibe from a wrecker driver up there." The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand paused halfway to her mouth. She set her spoon down carefully. "Big guy, older, wrecker with no plates?" Deacon felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Yeah, called himself Luther Pritchard." The woman nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting to hear that name eventually. "I work the truck stop here, night shift manager. Name's Mavis Harland. I've seen that wrecker roll through here 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Always after midnight, always during storms. Never stops for fuel, never comes inside. Just idles at the edge of the lot for a few minutes, then leaves. Last week a driver told me the same guy tried to convince him his load had shifted and needed to be resecured at a private yard down in Colfax. Driver didn't bite, but he said the guy was persistent. Real persistent." Deacon wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. "CHP know about this?" Mavis shrugged. "I called it in twice. They said they'd look into it. Far as I know, nothing came of it. Hard to prove anything when the guy's not breaking any laws just by driving around. But I'll tell you this. Every driver who's mentioned him has had one thing in common. They were all hauling high-value loads. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, luxury goods. Never saw him approach a guy hauling gravel or lumber." That detail landed in Deacon's mind like a stone dropping into still water. His load was electronics. 42 pallets of consumer goods bound for a distribution center in Sparks. Retail value north of $500,000. "You think he's scouting?" Deacon asked. Mavis took a slow sip of her soup, eyes fixed on the window where snow was piling up against the glass. "I think he's doing more than scouting. I think he's got a system. He finds a driver in a vulnerable spot, isolated, under time pressure, and he offers a solution that sounds reasonable. A shortcut, a repair, a place to wait out the storm. And once that driver takes the bait and follows him off the main route, that's when things go sideways. Load disappears, truck gets found abandoned, driver either can't be reached or tells a story that doesn't quite add up. It's smart, really, no violence, no forced entry, just manipulation and opportunity." Deacon thought about Luther's question again. "You hauling anything temperature sensitive?" It hadn't been a safety question. It had been a sorting question, a way to gauge whether the cargo was worth the risk. He felt a cold knot forming in his chest, the kind you get when you realize how close you came to something bad without fully understanding it at the time. "So what do I do?" he asked Mavis. "I've got a delivery window I'm already going to miss. If I sit here and wait out the storm, I'm looking at a service failure and a pissed-off receiver. But if I roll east and that wrecker's waiting somewhere between here and Truckee, I'm driving right into whatever trap he's set." Mavis leaned back on her stool, arms crossed. She had the look of someone who'd worked enough night shifts to know that most problems didn't have clean solutions. "You got any other drivers you trust heading the same direction?" Deacon shook his head. "I run solo. Always have." Mavis nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Then here's what I'd do. Wait until morning. Storm's supposed to break around 6. By then you'll have CHP visibility, daylight, and other trucks on the road. Yeah, you'll miss your window, but you'll still have your load, and your load's worth more than a service failure." Deacon wanted to argue, wanted to say he couldn't afford to wait, that his dispatcher would chew him out and his on-time percentage would tank. But the truth was, Mavis was right. A late delivery was a problem he could fix with a phone call and an apology. A hijacked load was a problem that ended careers. He finished his coffee and pulled out his phone. He called dispatch, explained the situation without going into every detail, and told them he was shutting down for weather. The dispatcher wasn't happy, but she didn't fight him. She'd heard enough storm stories over the years to know that sometimes you just had to stop and wait. When Deacon got back to his truck, the lot felt different. More drivers had pulled in since he'd been inside, and the place had taken on the atmosphere of a refugee camp. Rigs idling in neat rows, exhausts billowing white clouds into the black sky, drivers moving between cabs with thermoses and cigarettes, swapping stories about road conditions and chain requirements. It felt safer somehow, surrounded by steel and noise and other people who understood the rhythm of the road. Deacon climbed into his bunk, pulled the curtains tight, and set his alarm for 5:30 a.m. He tried to sleep, but every sound outside made his eyes snap open. A door slamming, an engine revving, the scrape of a snowplow blade on asphalt. Around 3 a.m. he heard it. The low growl of a diesel engine that didn't match the idle rhythm of the parked rigs. He pulled back the curtain just enough to see out. A wrecker was rolling slowly through the lot, no lights except the amber bar on the roof. It moved like it was searching, creeping past each truck, pausing for a few seconds, then moving on. Deacon's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see the driver's face, couldn't read the faded decal on the door, but he knew. It was Luther. The wrecker made a full loop of the lot, slow and deliberate, and then rolled back out toward the highway entrance. Deacon grabbed his phone and called 911. He gave them his location, described the wrecker, and told them it had just left heading eastbound. The dispatcher said a unit was en route, but in weather like this, response times were delayed. Deacon didn't go back to sleep. He sat upright in his bunk, curtain cracked, watching the lot. At 4:15 a.m., a California Highway Patrol cruiser pulled in, roof lights cutting through the snow. An officer stepped out, tall and lean, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd worked too many accident scenes in bad weather. He walked toward the diner, spoke briefly with someone inside, then started making rounds to the parked trucks. When he reached Deacon's rig, he knocked on the door. Deacon climbed down to meet him. The officer introduced himself as Eldon Rakes, a trooper out of the truckee station. He had a face like worn leather, the kind you earn from years of working mountain highways in all kinds of weather. His eyes were sharp, though, the kind that didn't miss much. "You the driver who called in the wrecker?" Deacon confirmed he was and gave Rakes the full story. The chain-up area, Luther's approach, the fake inspection claim, the CB warning, and the wrecker's late-night appearance in the lot. Rakes listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small waterproof notebook. When Deacon finished, Rakes looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. "You did the right thing turning back," Rakes said. "We've been tracking reports about this wrecker for about a month now, but we haven't been able to pin down a plate number or a registered owner. The vehicle shows up on storms, approaches drivers in isolated areas, and then disappears before we can get eyes on it. We think it's part of a cargo theft ring, but without a solid lead or a victim willing to go on record, we can't make an arrest. Most drivers who get approached either don't report it, or they do and nothing comes of it because there's no evidence of a crime. He's not breaking into trucks, not forcing anyone off the road. He's just persistent." Deacon felt a surge of frustration. "So what am I supposed to do? Just hope he doesn't follow me when I leave?" Rakes shook his head. "When you're ready to roll, you let me know. I'll escort you over the pass myself. I'm on shift until 8, and I've got nothing better to do than make sure you get to the Nevada line without trouble. If that wrecker shows up again, we'll have a reason to pull him over and run his information. That's the best I can offer." Deacon felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. "I appreciate that, officer." Rakes handed him a card with a direct number. "Call me when you're ready to move. I'll be at the Nyack chain-up area waiting for the pass to reopen. CHP's doing avalanche control at dawn, and once that's clear, we'll get traffic moving again. Should be around 6:30, 7 at the latest." Deacon thanked him, and Rakes walked back to his cruiser, pausing to speak with a few other drivers before leaving the lot. Deacon watched the taillights disappear into the snow, then climbed back into his cab. He sat there in the dark, listening to the wind rattle his mirrors, and thought about how close he'd come to following Luther Pritchard off the highway. How easy it would have been to believe the lie, to take the shortcut, to trust the wrong person at the wrong time. When his alarm went off at 5:30, the storm had started to break. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, and through the clouds he could see the first hint of gray dawn creeping over the mountains. Deacon did his pre-trip inspection in the cold morning air, checking his chains, his lights, his load straps. Everything was secure. Everything was ready. He called Trooper Rakes, and the officer confirmed he was already at Nyack waiting. "I'll see you in 20, Deacon said, and fired up his engine. The drive back up to the chain-up area felt different in the daylight. The road was still treacherous, still lined with snow and ice, but the visibility was better and there were other trucks on the move. Deacon joined a slow convoy of eastbound rigs, all of them chained up and creeping along at 40 miles an hour. When he reached Nyack, Trooper Rakes was parked at the entrance in his cruiser, roof lights flashing. Deacon pulled alongside and rolled down his window. Rakes gave him a nod. "Stay behind me." We're going over together." And they did. Slow, steady, with Rakes leading the way and Deacon following close behind. Trailer swaying slightly on the icy grade, but holding the line. They passed the turnout at Rainbow Bridge, the overlook at Donner Lake, the long descent toward Truckee. And the whole way, Deacon kept his eyes on the mirrors, watching for amber lights that never came. When they finally crossed the state line into Nevada and the highway opened up into flatter, clearer terrain, Rakes pulled over onto the shoulder. Deacon stopped behind him. The trooper walked back to Deacon's cab and looked up at him through the window. "You're clear from here," Rakes said. "Drive safe, and if you see that wrecker again, you call it in immediately. We'll get him eventually. Guys like that always make a mistake." Deacon thanked him one more time, and Rakes walked back to his cruiser and turned around, heading back west toward California. Deacon sat there for a moment on the shoulder, watching the trooper's lights fade into the distance. Then he shifted into gear and rolled east toward Sparks, his load still intact, his delivery late but not lost. He thought about Luther Pritchard, about Mavis Harlan's theory, about Trooper Rakes's warning, and he thought about how thin the line was between making it and not making it on a night like that. One wrong decision, one misplaced trust, and he'd have been another statistic, another report filed and forgotten. He made his delivery 3 hours late. The receiver wasn't happy, but they unloaded him without issue. Deacon signed the paperwork, logged the delay as weather-related, and rolled out of the yard with an empty trailer and a head full of questions that didn't have answers. He never saw Luther Pritchard again. Never heard his name on the CB, never got a follow-up call from CHP. It was like the man had dissolved back into the storm, waiting for the next driver, the next opportunity, the next mistake. And maybe that was the worst part. Not knowing if he'd escaped something real or just imagined the danger in the dark. 3 days passed before Deacon heard anything more about Luther Pritchard. 3 days of normal runs, routine stops, the kind of driving that lets you forget about close calls and bad decisions. He'd hauled a load of bottled water from Reno to Salt Lake City, then picked up a backhaul of industrial equipment heading to Sacramento. The whole time, he kept his CB on Channel 19, listening to the usual trucker chatter, waiting for someone to mention a wrecker or a chain-up scam or anything that sounded familiar. But there was nothing, just the ordinary complaints about traffic, fuel prices, and dispatchers who didn't understand how weather worked. It was late afternoon when his phone rang. Unknown number, 530 area code. Truckee. Deacon almost didn't answer. He was rolling through Reno, fighting rush-hour traffic on I-80, and the last thing he needed was a telemarketer or a wrong number. But something made him thumb the accept button. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, he put it on speaker and said his name. The voice that came back was Trooper Eldon Rakes, and he sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Mr. Woolridge, I wanted to follow up with you about the incident at Donner Pass. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Deacon eased into the right lane, putting some distance between himself and a sedan that was tailgating him too close. "Yeah, I can talk. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that meant Rakes was choosing his words carefully. "We found the wrecker, or at least, we found a wrecker that matches the description you gave us. It was abandoned in a turnout near Cisco Grove, about 12 miles west of where you encountered it. No plates," Vin filed off, registration stickers peeled clean. Whoever was driving it knew what they were doing. Deacon felt his grip tighten on the wheel. "What about Luther Pritchard? You get any identification?" Rakes let out a slow breath. "That's the problem. We don't think Luther Pritchard is a real person. We ran the name through every database we have. DMV, criminal records, commercial driver logs, nothing. No one by that name holds a wrecker license in California, Nevada, or any surrounding state. We think it was an alias, maybe one of several he uses depending on who he's talking to. The wrecker itself is a dead end too. It's an older Ford, probably mid-2000s, repainted multiple times. We found tool marks on the door where decals had been removed and reapplied. It's a shell, basically. A vehicle designed to look legitimate from a distance but falls apart under scrutiny. Deacon merged onto the off-ramp, heading toward a truck stop where he planned to fuel up and grab something to eat. His mind was racing, putting pieces together that didn't quite fit. So what does that mean? Is this guy still out there? Rakes didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped lower, like he was speaking to someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it confirmed. We think there's more than one person involved. This isn't just a lone operator running a scam, it's organized. We found tire tracks near the wrecker that suggest at least 2 other vehicles were present when it was abandoned. One set matches a heavy-duty pickup, the other looks like a box truck or a small moving van. Our theory is they use the wrecker to scout targets, identify high-value loads, and then coordinate with other vehicles to intercept or redirect those trucks once they're off the main highway. Deacon pulled into the truck stop and found a parking spot near the fuel island. He killed the engine, but left the phone on speaker, staring at the dashboard like it might give him answers. So, what happened? Why'd they dump the wrecker? Rakes explained that they weren't entirely sure, but the best guess was that word had gotten out. Too many drivers reporting the same vehicle. Too much attention from CHP, too much risk. So they cut their losses, ditched the wrecker, and probably moved on to a different vehicle with a different setup. Maybe a different stretch of highway entirely. Maybe a different state. Cargo theft rings didn't stay in one place for long. They followed opportunity, and when opportunity dried up, they moved. We're sharing information with Nevada Highway Patrol, Wyoming, Utah, all the western states that see heavy freight traffic on I-80. If this group shows up somewhere else, we'll have a better chance of identifying them. But in the meantime, I wanted you to know that your report made a difference. We wouldn't have found that wrecker if you hadn't called it in, and we wouldn't be coordinating with other agencies if we didn't have your statement on file. Deacon appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't make him feel any safer. If anything, it made him more aware of how vulnerable he'd been that night, how close he'd come to making a decision that could have ended very differently. "Is there anything else I should be watching for?" Deacon asked. "Any other signs that these guys might be operating in a new area?" Rakes thought for a moment. "If you see a wrecker without clear identification, or if someone approaches you at a chain-up area or rest stop claiming to be doing inspections without proper authorization, don't engage. Get their description, get a photo if you can do it safely, and call it in immediately. These guys rely on isolation and time pressure. They target drivers who are tired, behind schedule, or dealing with bad weather. They offer solutions that sound reasonable in the moment, but the goal is always the same. Get you off the main highway, away from cameras and witnesses, and then take your load." Deacon thanked him for the call and hung up. He sat in his cab for a long time after that, staring out at the fuel island where other drivers were going through their routines. Swiping cards, setting nozzles, walking inside to grab coffee and snacks. It all looked so normal, so ordinary. But Deacon knew better now. He knew that somewhere out there someone was watching. Someone was making notes about which trucks carried what cargo, which drivers looked tired or rushed, which routes were most vulnerable. And the worst part was, you couldn't tell who it was just by looking. Luther Pritchard, or whoever he really was, had looked like any other roadside mechanic. The wrecker had looked legitimate enough from a distance. The whole setup had been designed to blend in, to avoid suspicion until it was too late. Deacon fueled up, grabbed a sandwich from inside, and got back on the road. He had a delivery in Sacramento the next morning, and he wanted to make good time. But as he rolled west toward the Sierra, he found himself checking his mirrors more often than usual. Every wrecker he passed made his pulse spike. Every turnout with a parked vehicle made him slow down and take a longer look. It wasn't paranoia exactly, it was awareness. The kind of awareness you develop after you've seen how thin the margin is between safety and disaster. That night, he pulled into a truck stop near Auburn and parked under the brightest light he could find. He did his walk around with a flashlight, checking every strap, every seal, every lock. When he climbed into his bunk, he set his phone within reach and made sure the ringer was on. He didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made him tense. The hiss of air brakes, the clang of a fuel nozzle, the distant rumble of a Jake brake echoing off the hills. He kept thinking about the abandoned wrecker, about the tire tracks Rakes had mentioned, about the 2 other vehicles that had been there when Luther's crew dumped it. How many people were involved? How long had they been running this operation? And how many drivers had they already hit before Deacon's report forced them to shut it down? Around 2 a.m., Deacon's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. The message was short. You made the right call turning back. They were waiting for you past Rainbow Bridge. Stay smart. Deacon stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He didn't know who'd sent it. Could have been another driver who'd heard the story on the CB grapevine. Could have been someone from CHP who didn't want to make an official call. Could have been someone inside the operation itself, someone who decided to get out before things got worse. He didn't reply. He just saved the number and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, Deacon made his delivery in Sacramento without incident. The receiver signed off on the load, and Deacon headed back to Reno for his next pickup. The whole drive, he kept thinking about that text message. They were waiting for you past Rainbow Bridge. If he'd followed Luther that night, if he'd taken the bait and rolled east instead of turning back, what would have happened? Would they have staged a fake breakdown to force him to stop? Would they have used another vehicle to box him in? Would they have done something worse? He thought about Mavis Harlan's theory, about how these operations worked. No violence, no forced entry, just manipulation and opportunity. But what happened when manipulation didn't work? What happened when a driver refused to cooperate, when they tried to fight back or run? Deacon had heard stories over the years, whispers on the CB about drivers who'd gone missing, trucks that had been found empty on remote stretches of highway, loads that had vanished without a trace. Most of those stories were probably exaggerated, the kind of urban legends that truckers told each other to pass the time. But some of them had to be real. Some of them had to be based on something that actually happened. When Deacon got back to Reno, he stopped at a truck stop he knew well, a place where a lot of veteran drivers congregated. He found a spot at the counter in the diner and ordered coffee. The driver next to him was an older guy, mid-60s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of sun-baked leather. His name was stitched on his jacket. Deacon didn't recognize him, but the man had the look of someone who'd been on the road longer than Deacon had been alive. "You run Donner much?" Deacon asked, keeping his tone casual. The older driver nodded. "Used to run it all the time. These days I try to avoid it in winter. Too much risk, not enough reward." Deacon took a sip of his coffee. "Ever run into trouble up there? Guys trying to pull scams or redirect you off the highway?" The older driver gave him a long look, like he was deciding how much to say. "You asking because you heard something, or because you experienced something?" Deacon told him about Luther Pritchard, about the chain-up area, the fake inspection claim, the wrecker that had been abandoned. The older driver listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Deacon finished, the man set his coffee cup down and leaned back on his stool. "You got lucky," he said simply. "Real lucky. I know 2 drivers who didn't. One of them took a detour a wrecker driver suggested, said there was a shorter route around traffic. Truck was found 3 days later in a warehouse lot outside Colfax. Load gone, driver traumatized, couldn't give a clear description of what happened. Said he'd been drugged, but the talk screen came back negative. Other driver I know got boxed in at a rest stop, said a guy tried to force his way into the cab. Driver locked the doors and laid on the horn until other trucks came over. Guy ran off, never caught." Deacon felt a chill run down his spine. When did this happen? The older driver shrugged. First one was maybe 2 years ago. Second one was last winter. CHP knows about it, but like I said, hard to prove anything when the guys doing it don't leave evidence. They're smart. They know how to work the system. They know which areas don't have cameras, which rest stops are understaffed, which drivers are most vulnerable. And they know how to disappear when things get hot. Deacon finished his coffee in silence. He wanted to ask more questions, wanted to know if there was a pattern or a way to predict where these guys would strike next. But the truth was, there probably wasn't. These operations moved like shadows, appearing when conditions were right and vanishing when the light got too bright. All you could do was stay alert, trust your instincts, and hope you made the right call when the moment came. Before he left the diner, the older driver gave him one more piece of advice. Don't let it make you paranoid, but don't let it make you careless either. The road's got enough dangers without adding human ones to the mix. You did good turning back that night. A lot of guys wouldn't have. They'd have talked themselves into believing it was fine, that they were overreacting. But overreacting is what keeps you alive in this job. Remember that. Deacon carried those words with him for the rest of the day. He picked up his next load, a shipment of agricultural equipment heading east toward the Salt Lake City, and rolled out as the sun was setting. The highway stretched ahead of him, familiar and endless, and for the first time in days he felt like he could breathe again. But he knew the feeling wouldn't last. Every time he saw a wrecker on the shoulder, every time he passed a chain-up area in the dark, he'd remember Luther Pritchard's face and the way the man had moved between trucks like he was shopping for something specific. And he'd remember the text message. They were waiting for you past Rainbow Bridge. Somewhere out there, someone had been watching him that night. Someone had known his route, his load, his schedule. And if Deacon had made a different choice, if he'd followed Luther instead of turning back, he'd have driven straight into whatever trap they'd set. The thought made his hands tighten on the wheel. It made him check his mirrors more often, made him scrutinize every vehicle that stayed behind him for too long. It made him careful in ways he hadn't been before. That night, Deacon stopped at a truck plaza just outside of Elko, Nevada. He parked under lights, did his walk-around with a flashlight, and climbed into his bunk. Before he closed his eyes, he sent a text to the unknown number that had messaged him. Who is this? He didn't expect a reply, and he didn't get one. But he left his phone on the seat next to him, just in case. Because the road was a strange place, full of people who meant you harm and people who meant you well, and sometimes it was impossible to tell which was which until it was too late. As he drifted off to sleep, Deacon thought about Trooper Rake's words. These guys rely on isolation and time pressure. That was the key. They found you when you were vulnerable, when you were alone, when you were making decisions based on exhaustion and desperation instead of clarity and caution. And the only defense was to recognize those moments before they happened, to see the trap before you stepped into it. Deacon had done that once. He'd trusted his instincts, ignored the pressure of his delivery window, and made the hard choice to turn back. He didn't know if he'd have the courage to do it again, but he hoped he would, because the alternative was something he didn't want to think about. The next morning, he woke to sunlight streaming through his windshield and the sound of other trucks firing up their engines. He checked his phone. No new messages, no missed calls, just another day on the road, another load to deliver, another stretch of highway to cover. But as he rolled east toward Salt Lake City, Deacon couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by Luther Pritchard or his crew, they were long gone by now, but by the road itself, by the miles of asphalt and steel and possibility that stretched from coast to coast. The road was always watching, and if you weren't careful, if you let your guard down for even a moment, it would swallow you whole. 2 weeks had passed since the phone call from Trooper Rakes, and Deacon had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Almost. He'd run loads through Utah, Idaho, back through Nevada, the usual circuit that kept him moving and kept the bills paid. Every night he parked under lights. Every rest stop he passed got a long, hard look before he decided whether to pull in. He'd started carrying a dash cam now, front and rear, recording everything. It gave him a small measure of comfort, knowing that if something happened, there'd be evidence, a record that couldn't be erased or explained away. But the truth was, nothing had happened. No wreckers with missing plates. No men in chain-up areas asking about cargo. No anonymous text messages in the middle of the night. It was quiet, and quiet should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like waiting, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air goes still and the birds stop singing. Deacon had been driving long enough to know that quiet on the road didn't mean safe. It just meant you hadn't seen the danger yet. It was mid-March when dispatch called with a load that made Deacon's stomach tighten. Electronics again, high-value consumer goods, Sacramento to a distribution center just outside Reno, the same route he'd been running the night he met Luther Pritchard. Same cargo type, same weather window, same stretch of I-80 that cut through Donner Pass. Deacon could have refused it. Could have told dispatch he wasn't comfortable with the route, that he needed something different. But refusing loads meant losing money, and losing money meant falling behind on truck payments, insurance, fuel cards. The economics of trucking didn't leave much room for fear. So he took the load. He picked it up at a warehouse in Sacramento in Saint-Orsau just after noon. Spent an hour doing his pre-trip inspection with more care than usual, checking every seal, every strap, every lock twice. The load was clean, paperwork in order, nothing out of place. He called dispatch to confirm the route and delivery window, then rolled out onto I-80 eastbound. The weather report said clear skies over the pass, no snow in the forecast, temperatures just above freezing. Good conditions, safe conditions. Deacon tried to believe it. The drive through the foothills was uneventful. Traffic was light for a weekday afternoon, mostly passenger cars and a few other trucks scattered across the lanes. Deacon kept his CB on Channel 19, listening to the usual chatter. Drivers comparing fuel prices, complaining about construction zones, warning each other about speed traps. Normal road noise, nothing that set off alarm bells. But as he climbed higher into the mountains and the pines closed in on both sides of the highway, Deacon felt the old tension creeping back into his shoulders. He passed the turnoff for Emigrant Gap and thought about Mavis Harland. Wondered if she was working tonight, if she'd heard anything more about Luther Pritchard's crew. He thought about calling the truck stop, asking if she'd seen any suspicious activity, but he didn't want to sound paranoid. Didn't want to be the driver who couldn't let go of a close call, who saw threats in every shadow. So he kept driving, kept his eyes on the road and his hand steady on the wheel. The Nyack chain-up area appeared on his right as the grade steepened. Deacon slowed instinctively, scanning the lot even though chains weren't required today. A few trucks were parked there, drivers taking breaks or doing inspections, but no wreckers. No vehicles that looked out of place, just the ordinary rhythm of the highway, people stopping and starting, coming and going. Deacon accelerated back to speed and focused on the road ahead. The summit was close now, just a few more miles of climbing before the descent into Nevada. That's when his CB crackled with a voice he didn't recognize. "Eastbound truck with the covered load. You got a trailer light out on your driver's side. Might want to pull over and check it before CHP spots you." Deacon glanced at his mirrors. His trailer lights were all functioning. He'd checked them 20 minutes ago at the last turnout, but he keyed up the mic anyway, keeping his voice neutral. "Appreciate the heads up, but my lights are good, just check them." A pause. Then the voice came back, friendlier this time. "Could have sworn I saw it flickering. Maybe it's just the angle. You heading to Reno?" Deacon's hand tightened on the mic. That was a strange question. Most drivers didn't ask about destinations unless they were coordinating a convoy or looking for a fuel stop recommendation. "Yeah, Reno," Deacon said, keeping it vague. "You running the same direction?" Another pause. "We are. Got a haul going to Sparks. If you want company over the pass, we're about 2 miles behind you. Blue Freightliner, running heavy." Deacon's pulse quickened. He checked his mirrors again. There were headlights behind him, but at this distance, he couldn't tell what kind of truck they belonged to. Could have been a Freightliner, could have been anything. "I appreciate it," Deacon said carefully, "but I'm good on my own. Safe travels." He hung up the mic and switched his CB to scan mode, cycling through channels to see if anyone else was talking about him. Channel 19 was quiet. Channel 9 had a brief weather report. Channel 17 had 2 drivers arguing about the best burger joint in Winnemucca. Nothing suspicious, but the voice had bothered him. The way it had started with a fake concern about his trailer light, then pivoted to asking his destination. It felt like a probe, a way to gather information without seeming threatening. Deacon kept his speed steady and watched his mirrors. The headlights behind him were closer now, maybe a mile back, gaining slowly. It could have been the Freightliner. It could have been anyone. But Deacon wasn't taking chances. He reached for his phone and pulled up Trooper Rake's number. Didn't call yet, just had it ready. If things went sideways, he wanted to be able to hit dial without fumbling. The road crested at Donner Summit and began its long descent toward Truckee. This was the stretch where things could go wrong fast. Steep grades, tight curves, limited visibility around bends. If someone wanted to box you in or force you off the road, this was where they'd do it. Deacon downshifted, let the Jake brake handle most of the deceleration, and kept his eyes moving between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. The headlights were still there, holding distance now, not closing any further. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It felt calculated, like whoever was back there knew exactly how far to stay to avoid spooking him. Deacon's CB crackled again. Different voice this time, rougher, older. "Eastbound at mile marker 168, anybody see a wrecker pulled off near the shoulder? Thought I saw one with no lights." Deacon's blood went cold. Mile marker 168 was just ahead, maybe half a mile. He scanned the roadside as he approached, looking for any sign of a vehicle. Trees pressed close to the shoulder here, shadows deep enough to hide anything smaller than a semi. He didn't see a wrecker, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. He keyed up his mic. "Negative. No wrecker visible from my position. You eastbound or westbound?" No response. Deacon tried again. "Driver asking about the wrecker. What's your location?" Still nothing. The voice had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only static and the low hum of his engine. Deacon's hands were slick on the wheel now, his breathing shallow. This was a setup. He could feel it in his gut, the same instinct that had told him to turn back 2 weeks ago. They were using the CB to coordinate, to position themselves, to flush him into making a mistake. He passed mile marker 168 without seeing anything unusual, but he didn't relax. The descent continued, the road carving through granite walls and pine forests that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. The headlights behind him had fallen back slightly, maybe intentionally, maybe because they'd decided he wasn't worth the effort. Deacon didn't know which, and he didn't wait to find out. At the next turnout, a small paved area barely big enough for 2 cars, he saw a CHP cruiser parked with its lights off. Deacon hit his turn signal and pulled in hard, tires crunching on gravel. The cruiser's door opened immediately, and Trooper Eldon Rakes stepped out. Deacon's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Rakes walked up to the driver's side window, calm and deliberate, like he'd been expecting this. "You called it in," Rakes said. It wasn't a question. Deacon shook his head. "I didn't call. I was about to. But you're here." Rakes nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the highway behind Deacon's truck. "I've been running patrol on this stretch every night for the past 2 weeks. Random stops, random turnouts. Ever since we found that wrecker, CHP's been keeping a closer eye on Donner. I saw you pass the chain-up area and figured I'd shadow you over the summit, just in case." Deacon felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. "There's a truck behind me. Blue Freightliner," the driver said. "Might be nothing, but they've been pacing me since Nyack, and someone on the CB asked about a wrecker near mile marker 168. Voice disappeared before I could get a response." Rakes pulled out a small notebook and made a note. "I didn't see a wrecker, but I'll call it in. As for the Freightliner, I'll wait here and have a look when they pass. You keep rolling. I'll follow at a distance, just to make sure nobody gets ideas." Deacon wanted to thank him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just nodded and pulled back onto the highway, merging carefully into the right lane. Rakes followed a minute later, staying a quarter-mile back, far enough to look like regular traffic but close enough to close the gap if needed. Deacon kept his speed steady, his breathing slow, and his eyes locked on the road. The headlights that had been following him never reappeared. Either they'd turned off somewhere, or they'd decided the presence of CHP wasn't worth the risk. By the time Deacon reached Truckee, the worst of the grade was behind him. The highway opened up, the trees thinned out, and the lights of the town glittered in the valley below. Rakes stayed with him until the Nevada state line, then flashed his high beams twice and peeled off at the last California exit. Deacon understood. Rakes had escorted him as far as his jurisdiction allowed. From here, Deacon was on his own. The rest of the drive to Reno felt surreal. The highway was wide and flat, traffic light, conditions perfect. But Deacon couldn't shake the feeling that he'd narrowly avoided something. That the voice on the CB asking about the wrecker had been a signal, a way for someone to confirm his position. That the Freightliner pacing him hadn't been coincidence. That if Rakes hadn't been there, if Deacon had been alone on that descent, things would have gone very differently. He made his delivery at the Sparks distribution center just after 8 p.m. right on schedule. The receiver signed off without comment, and Deacon pulled out of the yard with an empty trailer and a head full of questions. He drove to a truck stop on the east side of Reno and parked under the brightest lights he could find. Did his walk around, checked his seals even though the trailer was empty now, and climbed into his bunk. His phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. This time, the message was longer. "They're changing tactics. Not using wreckers anymore, using other trucks. Blue Freightliner was theirs. They'll try again on a different route. Watch for convoys that feel too coordinated. Watch for voices on CB asking questions they shouldn't. Stay smart." Deacon stared at the screen, his mind racing. He typed back, "Who are you?" 3 dots appeared, flickered, then disappeared. No response came. Deacon set his phone down and stared up at the ceiling of his cab. Whoever was sending these messages knew too much to be a random driver. They were either inside the operation and trying to warn him, or they were law enforcement running some kind of off-book surveillance. Either way, the message was clear. This wasn't over. The next morning, Deacon called Trooper Rakes and told him about the text. Rakes listened without interrupting, then asked Deacon to forward the messages to him. "We'll try to trace the number, but I'm guessing it's a burner. These guys are smart. They know how to stay invisible, but the information is useful. If they're switching from wreckers to regular trucks, that changes how we look for them. Makes it harder, but not impossible." Rakes paused, then added, "You did good last night. Trusting your instincts, pulling over when you saw me. A lot of drivers would have just kept going, convinced themselves it was nothing. But you didn't. That's the difference between making it and not making it." Deacon thanked him and ended the call. He sat in his cab for a long time after that, watching other drivers go about their routines. Fueling up, grabbing food, doing their pre-trip inspections. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. But Deacon knew better now. He knew that somewhere in that sea of trucks and trailers and ordinary-looking people, there were predators. People who studied routes and schedules and cargo manifests. People who used CB radios and fake vehicle identities to hunt for opportunities. People who relied on the fact that most drivers were too tired or too pressured to see the trap until it was too late. Deacon thought about the abandoned wrecker near Cisco Grove, about the tire tracks suggesting multiple vehicles, about Luther Pritchard's fake name and the way he'd asked about temperature-sensitive cargo. He thought about the older driver in the diner who'd told him about 2 other victims, one drugged, one traumatized. He thought about the text messages warning him, guiding him, keeping him one step ahead. And he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one close call on one stretch of highway. This was a system, a network, an operation that had been running for years and would keep running until someone stopped it. But stopping it wasn't Deacon's job. His job was to haul freight, make deliveries, stay alive. And right now, staying alive meant staying vigilant. Meant checking his mirrors, scanning the CB, trusting his gut when something felt wrong. It meant accepting that the road would always have dangers, visible and invisible, and that the only defense was to never let your guard down. Not for a moment. Not for a mile. Not ever. Deacon pulled out of the truck stop and headed south on US 95. Away from I-80, away from Donner Pass, away from the mountains that had nearly swallowed him twice. He had a load waiting in Las Vegas, an easy run through open desert with good visibility and plenty of escape routes. It felt safer somehow, even though he knew safety was an illusion. The predators could be anywhere. They could adapt, move, change tactics. They could follow him to Nevada, Arizona, Utah, anywhere the highways ran and the freight needed moving. But they'd have to catch him first, and Deacon wasn't planning on making it easy. He'd learned his lesson on that cold night at Nyack when a man named Luther Pritchard had asked him about his cargo, and Deacon had chosen to walk away. He'd learned that survival on the road wasn't about being the fastest or the toughest. It was about being the smartest, about recognizing the moment when something shifted from normal to dangerous, and having the courage to act on that recognition even when it cost you time, money, or pride. As the Nevada desert opened up around him and the mountains faded into the rearview mirror, Deacon thought about all the drivers who hadn't been as lucky, the ones who'd taken the bait, followed the wrecker, believed the lie, the ones whose trucks had been found empty, whose loads had vanished, whose stories didn't make sense because the truth was too horrifying to tell. He thought about how close he'd come to being one of them, and how thin the margin had been. A few different decisions, a few different circumstances, and he'd be a statistic instead of a survivor. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, and Deacon kept his hand steady on the wheel. He didn't know if he'd ever see Luther Pritchard again, or whatever name the man was using now. He didn't know if the blue Freightliner would reappear on a different highway, with a different voice on the CB and a different tactic. He didn't know if the anonymous messages would keep coming, or if they'd stop as suddenly as they'd started. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next time someone approached him with a story that sounded too convenient, a solution that seemed too easy, a shortcut that promised to save him time, he'd remember the feeling he'd had at Nyack, the cold knot of fear in his gut, the voice on the CB warning him away, the choice to turn back when every instinct and every economic pressure told him to keep going forward. And he'd make the same choice again, every single time. Because the road was full of people who counted on you being decent, being trusting, being tired enough to make mistakes. And the only way to beat them was to recognize that decency could be a trap, that trust had to be earned, and that being tired wasn't an excuse for being careless. Deacon had learned those lessons the hard way, and he carried them with him now, mile after mile, load after load, into a future that was uncertain but at least still his to navigate. Somewhere behind him, back in the mountains, the operation continued. The predators hunted. The traps were set. And other drivers who didn't know what Deacon knew, rolled into the dark and hoped for the best. Some of them would make it. Some of them wouldn't. And the difference between the two would come down to instinct, luck, and the willingness to question what looked normal until you were absolutely certain it was safe. Deacon's phone buzzed one last time as he crossed into the open desert. He glanced at the screen. The unknown number. One final message. You're learning. Keep learning. The road is long and they're patient, but so are you. Drive safe. Deacon didn't respond. He just set the phone down, adjusted his mirrors, and kept rolling. The sun was setting behind him now, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and ahead of him the highway stretched toward Las Vegas like a ribbon of possibility. It wasn't safety, it wasn't certainty, but it was movement, and movement was life, and life was all he had. He thought about calling his dispatcher, telling her he didn't want to run Donner Pass anymore, asking for different routes. But he knew he wouldn't, because avoiding one stretch of highway wouldn't solve the problem. The predators would just find him somewhere else. The only real solution was to stay sharp, stay aware, and trust that when the moment came, when the choice presented itself again, he'd recognize it for what it was and make the right call. And if he ever doubted himself, if he ever wondered whether he was being paranoid or overcautious, he'd think about Luther Pritchard's face in the snow, the way the man had stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting for Deacon to make a mistake. The way the wrecker had idled at the edge of the lot like a patient predator. The way the voice on the CB had asked about his cargo, his destination, his vulnerability. And he'd remember that paranoia wasn't a weakness. It was survival. And survival was the only thing that mattered out here on the long, dark, endless American highway. Oran Kincaid had been running I-80 through Wyoming for 8 years, and he'd learned to read the sky the way some men read poker faces. You had to out here, where the weather could turn from clear to catastrophic in the time it took to fuel up and grab a sandwich. March 2023 brought the kind of spring storm that meteorologists got excited about and truckers dreaded, a low-pressure system sliding down from Canada with enough moisture to bury the high plains under 2 feet of snow in 12 hours. Oren had watched the forecasts all morning from a truck stop in Salt Lake City, weighing his options while nursing burnt coffee and wondering if the gamble was worth it. He was hauling agricultural equipment, heavy steel parts bound for a farm supply distributor in North Platte, Nebraska. The load wasn't time-sensitive in the way electronics or perishables were, but his dispatcher had made it clear that the receiver wanted it by Friday, and Friday was tomorrow. Orrin had two choices: sit in Salt Lake and wait out the storm, which could take 2 or 3 days and blow his delivery window completely, or make a run for it and hope he could get through Wyoming before the worst hit. The Wyoming Department of Transportation had I-80 open, but was warning of rapidly deteriorating conditions east of Rawlins. Chain law was already in effect. Wind gusts were forecasted at 50 miles per hour. Visibility would drop to near zero once the front moved through. Orrin made his decision the way he always did, by calculating risk against reward and hoping his gut was right. He chained up in the truck stop parking lot while the sky was still blue, double-checking every link and tensioner because once you were out on the high plains in a whiteout, there was no stopping to fix mistakes. His load was strapped tight, tarps secured, all his running lights and clearance markers checked twice. He called dispatch and told them he was rolling, that he'd keep them updated every hour, and that if conditions got too bad, he'd shut down at the first safe location. The dispatcher wished him luck in a tone that suggested she thought he'd need it. The first hour out of Salt Lake was deceptively calm. I-80 climbed through the Wasatch Range with clear skies and light traffic, just a handful of other trucks and a steady stream of passenger vehicles that didn't seem concerned about the storm bearing down from the north. Orrin kept his CB on Channel 19, listening to scattered reports from drivers already in Wyoming. Most of them were complaining about wind, but nothing catastrophic yet. One voice warned about a jackknifed truck near Rock Springs that had traffic backed up for 30 minutes. But by the time Orrin reached that stretch, the wreckage had been cleared and the highway was open. He crossed into Wyoming just after 2 p.m., and that's when he felt it. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many miles, and the wind started to hit the trailer in gusts strong enough to push the whole rig sideways. Orrin corrected with small steering adjustments, keeping his speed down to 55 and his hands firm on the wheel. The sky ahead had turned the color of old bruises, dark purple and gray with a sickly yellow edge that meant the front was close. He passed a digital highway sign flashing a warning. Winter storm warning in effect. High winds, blowing snow. Travel not recommended. Travel not recommended. That was the phrase the state used when they wanted to cover themselves legally but couldn't justify closing the road yet. It meant you could keep going, but if something happened, you were on your own. Orrin had seen those signs 100 times, and he'd ignored them almost as often because recommended wasn't the same as prohibited, and prohibited was the only word that mattered when you were trying to make a living hauling freight. He pushed on toward Rawlins, watching the horizon disappear behind a wall of white that looked like it was advancing toward him at highway speed. The snow started just west of Rawlins, light at first, just flurries swirling across the road in lazy spirals. Within 10 minutes it had thickened into a steady fall, and within 20 it was a full blizzard. Visibility dropped from a mile to 100 yards to 50 feet. Orrin slowed to 40, then 35, following the faint glow of taillights ahead of him because the lane markings had vanished under a blanket of white. His windshield wipers were working overtime, and even with the defroster on full blast, ice was forming in the corners of the glass. The wind was relentless now, hammering the trailer with gusts that made the whole rig shudder and groan. His CB crackled with voices, drivers calling out positions and conditions, trying to coordinate in the chaos. Eastbound at mile marker 215, can't see past my hood. Anybody else shutting down? Another voice responded, I'm pulling into the Sinclair station at Rawlins, not going any further in this. Oren checked his fuel, 3/4 of a tank, enough to make it to Laramie if the road stayed open. But the question wasn't fuel. The question was whether the road would stay open or whether Widot would drop the hammer and close I-80 entirely, trapping him in a truck stop parking lot for days. He made it to Rollins and saw the Sinclair station on his right, its lights barely visible through the snow. A dozen trucks were already parked there, engines idling, exhaust mixing with the blowing snow to create a white fog that hung over the lot like a shroud. Oren's instinct was to pull in, to join the others and wait it out. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of sitting in a parking lot for 3 days during a storm in 2019, watching his delivery window evaporate while his dispatcher sent increasingly frustrated messages. Maybe it was the knowledge that if he stopped now, he wouldn't make North Platte by Friday, and the receiver would refuse the load or hit him with a late fee that would eat into his profit margin. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, the part of him that had kept him on the road for 8 years, despite the long hours, the loneliness, the constant pressure. Oren keyed up his CB. "Eastbound at Rollins, anybody got a read on conditions toward Laramie?" Static for a moment, then a voice came back, older, tired. "I just came from Laramie heading west. It's bad, brother, real bad. Wind's worse than the snow. Saw 2 trucks blown off into the median between here and Elk Mountain. DOET's talking about closure any minute." Oren's hands tightened on the wheel. Elk Mountain. That was the stretch every Wyoming driver feared, a 20-mile gauntlet of high elevation and zero protection from the wind. In good weather, it was manageable. In a storm like this, it was a death trap, but it was also the only route east. There was no alternate highway, no detour that didn't add 8 hours and 2 states to the trip. It was I-80 or nothing. Oren made his choice. He rolled past the Sinclair station and kept going east into the teeth of the storm. The highway narrowed in his vision to just the ghostly outline of reflective posts on the shoulder and the occasional flash of red taillights ahead. Oren stayed in the right lane, hugging the shoulder as close as he dared, because if another truck came up behind him going too fast, he wanted room to bail out. His Jake brake was useless in these conditions. The engine brake just made the drive wheels want to slip, so he relied on careful throttle control and gentle applications of the service brakes. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would slam into the trailer hard enough to push him toward the center line, and every time Oren would correct, fighting the wheel, feeling the weight of 40,000 pounds of steel and cargo shifting beneath him. He passed a truck that had slid off into the median, its hazard lights flashing weakly through the snow. Oren grabbed his CB mic. "Disabled truck in the median near mile marker 228, driver visible in the cab." He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. If he tried to pull over in this wind, he'd end up in the ditch too. Someone else would have to help. Someone with a wrecker and chains and the kind of equipment you needed to pull a loaded semi out of a snowbank. Oren's job was to keep moving, to stay on the road, to not become another casualty. His phone buzzed, a text from dispatch. "YDOT just issued closure warning for I-80 Rollins to Laramie. Advise your status." Oren didn't respond. He was too busy trying to keep the truck between the lines he could no longer see. Another text. "Oren, confirm you're not on that stretch." He ignored it. If dispatch wanted to chew him out later, fine. Right now, he needed both hands on the wheel and all his focus on not dying. The wind was so strong now that snow wasn't falling. It was flying horizontally, smearing across his windshield in sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Oren's speed had dropped to 25 miles per hour, and even that felt too fast. He was navigating by instinct more than sight, feeling the road through the vibration of the steering wheel, listening to the sound of his tires on pavement versus the crunch of snow on the shoulder. It was like driving blind, and the terror of it settled into his chest like a cold stone. That's when he saw the lights. Not tail lights, not headlights. Amber lights rotating slowly, cutting through the white like a beacon. A vehicle was stopped on the shoulder ahead, hazards on, and as Orrin got closer he could make out the shape of a pickup truck with a light bar on the roof. Someone was standing next to it, waving both arms. Orrin's first thought was highway patrol, but as he slowed he realized there were no state markings on the truck, no official insignia, just a white pickup with aftermarket lights and a figure in a heavy coat gesturing for him to stop. Orrin eased off the throttle, letting the truck coast, debating whether to stop or keep going. The figure stepped closer to the road, still waving, and Orrin caught a glimpse of the man's face, older, weathered, the kind of face you saw on ranch hands and farmers who'd spent their lives working outside. The man pointed east, then made a slashing motion across his throat. Road closed. That was the message. Orrin cracked his window an inch and the wind screamed in, bringing snow and cold that bit at his face. "Road's closed ahead," the man shouted over the wind. "Just got word on the radio. State Patrol's blocking it at the Elk Mountain summit. You need to turn around or find shelter." Orrin shook his head. "Can't turn around in this, I'll get stuck." The man moved closer, bracing himself against the wind. "I've got a place. Private property, about 6 miles south of here. Big equipment barn, heated, plenty of space. You can park there and wait out the storm. Better than sitting on the highway." Orrin hesitated. Every instinct he'd developed over 8 years of driving told him not to follow a stranger off the main highway in the middle of a storm. But the alternative was trying to push through to a roadblock and then being forced to turn around anyway. Or sitting on the shoulder in near-zero visibility, waiting to get rear-ended by another truck. The man seemed to read his hesitation. "Name's Hobart Lyle. I own a ranch south of here. I've helped drivers before when the road closes. I'm not looking to scam you, just offering a safe place to wait it out." Orrin looked past the man at the wall of white that stretched in every direction. He couldn't see the road ahead, couldn't see the road behind. He was blind and getting more so by the minute. He keyed up his CB, broadcasting on Channel 19. "Any eastbound drivers near mile marker 235? Anybody got confirmation on a closure at Elk Mountain?" Static. He tried again. "Anybody copy?" Nothing. The storm was eating the signal, scattering it across the plains like everything else. Orrin looked back at the man standing in the snow, waiting for an answer. Hobart Lyle. The name sounded real enough. The offer sounded reasonable enough. And Orrin was out of better options. 6 miles south?" Orrin shouted through the window. Hobart nodded. "Take the next ranch access road. It's unmarked, but I'll lead you. Just follow my lights." Orrin made his decision. He nodded, and Hobart jogged back to his pickup, climbed in, and pulled onto the highway. His amber lights cut through the snow, and Orrin followed, easing back into gear and rolling slowly behind the pickup. The turnoff appeared sooner than expected, just a break in the fence line with tire tracks barely visible under fresh snow. Hobart's pickup turned south onto what could generously be called a road, but looked more like 2 ruts cutting through an open field. Orrin followed, feeling his trailer slip slightly as the pavement disappeared beneath him. The pickup's lights were the only point of reference now, a single beacon in an ocean of white. Orrin couldn't see fences, couldn't see landmarks, couldn't see anything but snow and wind and the taillights ahead. He thought about dispatch, about the delivery in North Platte, about the load that was supposed to arrive tomorrow. And he thought about how quickly things had gone from manageable to desperate, how a decision made in Salt Lake City that morning had led him here, following a stranger through a blizzard to a place he couldn't see and couldn't verify. The pickup slowed, and Orrin saw a structure emerging from the white. A large barn, maybe 60 feet long, with a gambrel roof and sliding doors big enough to drive a truck through. Hobart stopped his pickup and climbed out, walking to the barn doors and pulling them open. The interior was dark, but Orrin could make out the shape of farm equipment, tractors, and the dim outline of overhead lights. Hobart waved him in, and Orrin inched the truck forward, guiding it through the doors with inches to spare on either side. When he was fully inside, Hobart slid the doors closed behind him, and the wind's roar dropped to a muffled howl. Orrin killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, his heart hammering, his hands still gripping the wheel. He looked around. The barn was exactly what Hobart had promised. A working agricultural building with concrete floors, steel beams, and enough space to park 3 trucks if needed. But it was also isolated, miles from the highway, and Orrin had no idea where he was. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He tried his CB. Static. He was cut off, completely alone except for Hobart Lyle, a man he'd met 5 minutes ago and knew nothing about. Hobart appeared at the driver's side door, knocking on it gently. Orrin cracked the window. "You're safe here," Hobart said. "Storm should blow through by morning. I'll be up at the house if you need anything. There's a generator for the lights, and the heater works if you need it." He gestured toward a small propane heater mounted on the wall. "Help yourself. I'll check on you in a few hours." Orrin nodded, not sure what else to say. Hobart turned and walked toward a side door, disappearing into the storm. Orrin was alone again, sitting in a barn in the middle of nowhere, wondering if he'd just made the smartest decision of his life or the worst mistake. Orrin sat in his cab for a long time after Hobart left, listening to the storm rage outside the barn walls. The wind hammered at the metal siding with a sound like continuous thunder, and he could hear snow being driven against the structure in waves that made the whole building creak and groan. The barn was solid, he could tell that much, but it felt fragile compared to the violence happening outside. He tried his phone again, held it up near the windshield, moved it around looking for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The screen showed no service in letters that felt more final than they should have. He climbed down from the cab, boots hitting concrete that was cold enough to feel through the soles, and did a slow walk around his truck. The trailer was fine, straps still tight, tarp secure, no damage from the drive through the storm. His chains were caked with ice and snow, but they'd hold until he needed to move again. The barn itself was exactly what Hobart had described, a working agricultural space with tractors lined up against one wall, tool benches covered in equipment, stacks of feed bags piled near the back. Everything looked legitimate, well-maintained, the kind of operation a real rancher would run. But legitimate didn't mean safe. Orrin had been driving long enough to know that the most dangerous situations often looked the most normal from the outside. He thought about the stories he'd heard over the years, drivers who'd been lured off the highway with promises of help or shelter, only to have their loads stolen or worse. Most of those stories were probably exaggerated, the trucker equivalent of urban legends, but some of them had to be based on something real. And right now, Orrin was alone, isolated, with no communication and no way to verify anything Hobart had told him. He walked to the sliding doors and tried to push one open a few inches, just to see what conditions looked like outside. The door wouldn't budge. Snow had already drifted against it, packing tight enough to seal the gap. Orrin put his shoulder into it and managed to create a 6-inch opening. White chaos poured through, wind screaming, snow driving horizontal. He could barely see 10 feet beyond the door. The pickup Hobart had been driving was gone, presumably driven to wherever the house was, but Orrin couldn't see any structures, any lights, any sign of human habitation. Just white on white on white, the landscape erased by the storm. He pulled the door closed and latched it, then walked back to his truck. The barn had overhead lights, fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered, powered by the generator Hobart had mentioned. Orrin could hear it running somewhere outside, a distant mechanical chug that was barely audible over the storm. The propane heater was mounted on the wall near the far end of the barn, and when Orrin found the switch, it kicked on with a whoosh of blue flame. The heat was immediate and welcome, cutting through the cold that had already seeped into his bones during the drive. Orrin climbed back into his cab and pulled out his logbook. He needed to make notes about the delay, document the weather conditions, the road closure, the decision to seek shelter. If dispatch gave him grief later, he'd need a paper trail showing he'd made reasonable choices given the circumstances. He wrote for a few minutes, then stopped and stared at the page. The words looked hollow, insufficient to capture what had actually happened. How did you document the feeling of following a stranger into a blizzard? How did you explain the calculation you'd made between danger and necessity, between risk and survival? He set the logbook aside and tried the CB again, cycling through channels, listening for any voice that might cut through the static. Channel 19 was dead. Channel 9 was dead. Even the weather channels were silent, just white noise that matched the white chaos outside. Orrin turned the CB off to save battery and sat in the dark cab, trying to think through his situation logically. He was stuck here until the storm passed, that much was certain. Even if the road opened up tonight, he couldn't navigate back to I-80 in these conditions. He'd have to wait for morning, hope the visibility improved, and hope Hobart came back to guide him out. The hope part bothered him. He was putting a lot of trust in a man he'd just met, a man whose only credentials were a weathered face and a reasonable story. Orrin thought about the conversation on the highway, replaying it in his mind, looking for red flags he might have missed. Hobart had known the road was closed, but how? He'd said he got word on the radio, but from who? State Patrol, other drivers, the local news? And why had he been out on I-80 in the first place, parked on the shoulder in the middle of a blizzard, waiting to flag down trucks? The more Orrin thought about it, the less sense it made. If Hobart was just a good Samaritan helping stranded drivers, why hadn't he mentioned other trucks? Why hadn't he said, "I've got 3 rigs already parked at my place, you can join them"? Why had he made it sound like Orrin was the only one, the only driver who needed help? Orrin's gut started to tighten, that same instinct that had kept him out of trouble on the road for 8 years. Something wasn't adding up, and the fact that he couldn't put his finger on what bothered him even more than the isolation. He pulled his phone out again and scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone he could text when the signal came back. Dispatch would be the logical choice, but they'd just yell at him for being off route. His ex-wife would probably answer, but their relationship was complicated enough without adding distress calls from the middle of nowhere. He thought about calling 911, documenting his location in case something went wrong, but he didn't even know his location. 6 miles south of mile marker 235 on a ranch access road didn't narrow it down much in country this empty. Time crawled. Orrin checked his watch every 10 minutes, each time surprised that only 10 minutes had passed. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, the wind's pitch rising to a shriek that made the barn walls vibrate. He thought about the other drivers who'd pulled into that Sinclair station in Rollins, wondered if they were sitting in their cabs right now feeling smart for stopping, or if they were second-guessing themselves, wondering if they should have pushed on. At least they had other trucks around them, other drivers to talk to on the CB, the illusion of safety that came from numbers. Orrin tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made him tense, waiting for the barn doors to slide open, waiting for Hobart to return, waiting for something to happen that would either confirm his paranoia or prove it wrong. Around 9 p.m., he heard footsteps outside the side door, the one Hobart had used to leave. Oren's hand went instinctively to the door lock, making sure it was engaged. Then he grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The door opened, and Hobart stepped in, covered in snow, carrying a thermos and a paper bag. "Thought you might be hungry," Hobart said, his voice echoing in the barn. He walked towards the truck, and Oren cracked his window, keeping the door locked. Hobart held up the thermos. "Coffee, and some sandwiches. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going." Oren took the items through the window, keeping his distance, keeping his options open. "Appreciate it. Any word on the road?" Hobart shook his head. "State Patrol's got I-80 closed from Rawlins to Laramie. Won't reopen until morning at the earliest, and that's if the storm breaks. Radio's saying this front's got another 6 hours in it." Oren unscrewed the thermos and smelled the coffee. It was real, hot, no chemical smell that would suggest anything wrong with it. But he didn't drink it, not yet, not until he'd had more time to think. "You said you've helped other drivers before. When was the last time?" Hobart thought for a moment, brushing snow off his coat. "Last winter, maybe February. Had 2 trucks stuck on my access road, helped them get back to the highway after the plows came through. Before that, couple years back, had a driver break down near my property line. Let him use my phone, wait in the barn until the wrecker arrived." The stories sounded plausible, the kind of thing a rancher in Wyoming might do as a matter of course. But Oren noticed Hobart didn't offer names, didn't say what company the drivers worked for, didn't give any details that could be verified. "You live out here alone?" Oren asked. Hobart nodded. "Wife passed 3 years ago. Kids are grown, living in Denver and Cheyenne. It's just me and a couple hired hands who help during calving season. They're not here now. Storm came in too fast." Oren filed that information away. If Hobart was alone, that was both better and worse. Better because it meant fewer variables, fewer people involved if this turned out to be some kind of setup. Worse because it meant no witnesses, no one else around if things went sideways. "How far are we from the highway?" Oren asked. Hobart gestured vaguely north. 6 miles, like I said, maybe 7, depending on how the drifts are forming. Road won't be passable until the plows come through, and they won't come through until the storm stops." Oren nodded slowly, trying to reconcile the helpful rancher in front of him with the paranoid scenarios running through his head. Hobart seemed genuine, seemed like exactly what he claimed to be. But Oren had learned not to trust appearances, not to assume good intentions just because someone offered food and shelter. "I'm going to stay in my cab tonight," Oren said. "I appreciate the barn and the heat, but I'm more comfortable up here." Hobart shrugged. "Suit yourself. Offer stands if you need anything. I'll be at the house." After Hobart left, Oren set the coffee and sandwiches aside and pulled out his phone again. Still no signal. He tried to remember if he'd seen any cell towers on the drive-in, but the visibility had been so bad he hadn't seen anything except Hobart's taillights. He thought about the route they'd taken, tried to reconstruct it in his mind, but all he could remember was snow and wind and the feeling of driving blind. For all he knew, they could be 20 miles from I-80 instead of 6. They could be in the wrong county, the wrong state. He had no way to verify anything. He opened the paper bag and examined the sandwiches. Ham and cheese on white bread, wrapped in plastic wrap. Nothing that looked tampered with. The coffee in the thermos was still hot, steam rising when he unscrewed the cap. Oren's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since that morning in Salt Lake City, but he still hesitated. The rational part of his brain said he was being paranoid, that a rancher who wanted to rob him wouldn't bother bringing food first. But the survival part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive on the road for 8 years, said not to take chances when you didn't have to. He ate one of the sandwiches slowly, tasting each bite, waiting to see if he felt anything strange. Nothing happened. He was still hungry, still tired, still trapped in a barn in the middle of a blizzard. He drank some of the coffee, letting it warm him from the inside, and felt his muscles start to relax slightly. The heat from the propane heater had raised the temperature in the barn to something almost comfortable, and the storm's constant roar had become white noise, background static that made it hard to stay alert. Orrin fought against the drowsiness, forcing himself to stay awake, to keep watch. But his body had other ideas. He'd been driving for 12 hours before the storm hit, and the stress of navigating through the blizzard had burned through whatever reserves he'd had left. His eyes kept drifting closed, and every time he jerked them open he had to fight harder to keep them that way. He thought about turning the radio on, using noise to stay awake, but the battery was already low and he didn't want to drain it completely. Around midnight he gave up and let himself doze, propping his head against the window, one hand on the door lock, one foot on the floor so he'd wake up if he started to slump. Sleep came in fragments, brief moments of unconsciousness interrupted by the storm's fury or the creaking of the barn or his own paranoia forcing him awake. In one of those half-dreaming moments he thought he heard voices outside, low conversation barely audible over the wind. He sat up fast, heart pounding, and stared out the windshield at the empty barn. Nothing moved. The generator chugged on. The heater's blue flame flickered steadily. He climbed down from the cab and walked to the side door, pressing his ear against it, listening. The wind was too loud to hear anything else, but he could have sworn he'd heard voices. Male voices, plural, which meant either Hobart had lied about being alone, or someone else had arrived. Orrin walked back to his truck and pulled out a tire iron from the side compartment, the heavy metal cold in his hands. He wasn't planning to use it, wasn't planning to confront anyone, but having it made him feel slightly less vulnerable. He sat in his cab with the tire iron across his lap, watching the side door, waiting. An hour passed. 2 hours. Nothing happened. The voices, if they'd been real at all, didn't return. Orrin started to think he'd imagined them, his paranoid brain manufacturing threats out of wind noise and exhaustion. But he couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't let his guard down. He thought about his load, 40,000 pounds of agricultural equipment that probably wasn't worth stealing but could be if someone knew the right buyers. He thought about insurance fraud, about staged delays, about scams that involved isolating drivers and then claiming their loads had been damaged or lost. The more he thought, the worse the scenarios became. By 3 a.m., Orrin had convinced himself he was in serious trouble, that Hobart was part of a crew that specialized in stranded drivers, that the whole setup had been planned from the moment Hobart flagged him down on I-80. But the rational part of his brain kept pushing back, asking for evidence, asking why a thief would bother feeding his victim, why a criminal would go through the elaborate theater of pretending to be a helpful rancher when he could just rob Orrin at gunpoint and be done with it. Orrin didn't have answers. All he had was instinct, and his instinct was screaming at him that something was wrong. But instinct without evidence was just fear, and fear without action was paralysis. So he sat in his cab, tire iron in his lap, and waited for morning. Waited for the storm to break. Waited for Hobart to show his true intentions or prove himself innocent. Waited for the moment when he'd either laugh at his own paranoia or curse himself for not acting sooner. The storm finally started to ease around 5 a.m. The wind's howl dropped to a low moan, and the snow changed from horizontal sheets to vertical flakes. Orrin could see the far wall of the barn now, could make out details that had been invisible hours before. He tried his phone again, and this time he got a single bar of signal, flickering in and out but present. He immediately pulled up his messages and started typing to dispatch. Stuck at Ranch 6 mi south of I-80 near mile marker 235. Storm delay. Will update when road opens. He hit send and watched the message sit in the outbox trying to push through the weak signal. A minute later, it went through. Relief flooded through him. Not because dispatch could help, they couldn't, but because he'd established a record, a timestamp, a digital breadcrumb that proved where he was and when. If something happened now, at least someone would know to start looking. His phone buzzed with a reply from dispatch almost immediately. Copy. Keep us updated. North Platte receiver extended delivery window to Saturday. You're good on time. That was something, at least. One less pressure, one less reason to make stupid decisions. Orrin climbed down from his cab and walked to the barn doors. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was lightening from black to gray, the kind of pre-dawn glow that meant sunrise wasn't far off. He managed to push one of the doors open a few feet, enough to see outside. The landscape was transformed, everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. The ranch access road completely invisible. Drifts had piled up against fence lines and buildings, sculpted by the wind into shapes that looked almost organic. And in the distance, maybe a quarter-mile away, he could see a house, a simple ranch-style structure with smoke rising from the chimney. So Hobart had been telling the truth about that, at least. There was a house, and the house looked exactly like what you'd expect from a Wyoming rancher. No elaborate compound, no suspicious vehicles, just a working ranch in the middle of nowhere. Orrin felt some of his paranoia start to ease, replaced by embarrassment at how worked up he'd gotten. Maybe Hobart really was just a decent guy helping a stranded driver. Maybe the voices Orrin had heard were just the storm playing tricks. Maybe he'd been alone too long on the road, jumping at shadows, seeing threats where none existed. But then he heard the sound of an engine, and his tension snapped back. A vehicle was approaching, pushing through the snow, and as it got closer, Orrin recognized Hobart's white pickup. It pulled up to the barn doors, and Hobart climbed out, looking tired but alert. "Morning," he called. "Storm's past. Plows should be working the highway by now. Give them a couple of hours to clear I-80, then I can guide you back out to the main road." Orrin nodded, relief mixing with residual suspicion. "Appreciate it. Any chance I can use a phone? Mine's barely getting signal." Hobart gestured toward his pickup. "I've got a radio in the truck. You can use that to call whoever you need." Orrin followed him to the pickup, and Hobart handed him a CB handset connected to a more powerful base unit. Orrin keyed up and tried channel 19. This time, voices came back, faint but present. "Westbound near Laramie. Roads still closed, but plows are moving. Should be open by 8 or 9. Another voice chimed in. "I-80's a mess, east of Rollins. Saw 3 trucks in the median. Be careful out there." The voices were real. Other drivers, other trucks, the familiar rhythm of the road. Orrin felt something inside him unclench, a knot of anxiety he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He handed the radio back to Hobart. "Thanks. I'll be ready to move when the road opens." Hobart nodded and walked back toward his house, leaving Orrin alone in the barn again. Orrin stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered plains, thinking about the night he'd just survived and wondering if the danger had been real or imagined. He'd probably never know for sure. That was the nature of situations like this, ambiguous, uncertain, open to interpretation. All he knew was that he'd made it through, that his load was intact, and that in a few hours he'd be back on I-80 heading east toward North Platte like nothing had happened. But something had happened, even if he couldn't articulate what. He'd crossed a line between safety and isolation, between the known and the unknown, and he'd come back changed in ways he was still trying to understand. By 8 a.m., the plows had made enough progress that Hobart agreed to guide Orrin back to I-80. The ranch access road was still buried under snow, but Hobart's pickup had enough ground clearance and weight to break trail, and Orrin followed in his tracks, keeping his speed down to 10 miles per hour and his hands light on the wheel. The trailer fishtailed twice on the packed snow, but he corrected gently and kept moving forward. Every few minutes, Orrin's eyes would drift to his mirrors, checking the barn receding behind him, half expecting to see something that would confirm his suspicions from the night before. But there was nothing, just white landscape and the twin tracks of Hobart's tires cutting through virgin snow. The whole drive back took 40 minutes to cover what should have been a 10-minute run, and when they finally reached the highway, Orrin felt like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. His shoulders ached from tension, his jaw hurt from clenching, and his hands had left sweat marks on the steering wheel despite the cold. I-80 was open, but barely. A single lane had been plowed in each direction, with walls of snow piled 6 feet high on both shoulders. Traffic was moving at 40 miles per hour, a slow procession of trucks and passenger vehicles creeping east under a sky that was now brilliantly blue and achingly cold. The kind of sky that made you forget how violent the storm had been just hours before, how close you'd come to being swallowed by it. Hobart pulled onto the shoulder at the junction, and Orrin stopped beside him. The ranch owner climbed out of his pickup and walked over to Orrin's window, his breath creating clouds in the frozen air. Orrin rolled down his window, feeling the bite of wind on his face. "You're all set," Hobart said, his voice carrying the same friendly tone it had maintained throughout their encounter. "Road's clear from here to Laramie. Take it slow, watch for ice under the snow, and you'll be fine." His eyes, weathered and creased from years of Wyoming sun and wind, looked genuine. There was no hint of deception there, no telltale nervousness or evasion. Just a rancher who'd helped a stranded driver, the way ranchers had been doing out here for generations. Orrin wanted to say something, wanted to thank the man or apologize for his suspicion, or ask the questions that had kept him awake all night. Questions like, "Why do you do this? How many drivers have you helped? What did you think when you saw me struggling in the storm?" But all that came out was, "I appreciate the help." The words felt inadequate, insufficient to capture the complexity of what had happened, but they were all Orrin could manage. Hobart gave him a tired smile, the kind that suggested he'd been up most of the night too, probably monitoring the storm, checking his livestock, making sure his property had weathered the worst. "That's what we do out here. Look after each other. Drive safe." He pulled back onto the highway heading west, back toward his ranch, and Orrin sat on the shoulder for another minute, watching the white pickup disappear into the traffic. The pickup looked smaller now in daylight, less menacing, just another work vehicle on a rural highway. Orrin tried to reconcile the helpful rancher he'd just spoken with against the dire warnings and suspicious circumstances that had plagued him all night. Nothing added up cleanly. Human behavior rarely did. Then he shifted into gear and rolled east, merging into the slow convoy of trucks that stretched ahead as far as he could see. The drive to Laramie was uneventful but tense. The highway was icy in patches, black ice hiding under snow that looked harmless from a distance but turned treacherous when your tires hit it. Orrin kept his speed steady at 35, well below the posted limit, and his focus sharp. Every slight shimmy of the trailer made his heart rate spike. Every time he felt the truck want to drift, he corrected with minimal steering input, the way veteran drivers learn to do after enough winters on the road. The wind had picked up again, not storm level, but strong enough to push the trailer around, creating a constant battle between forward momentum and lateral drift. His CB was active now, drivers calling out hazards and road conditions, sharing information about which lanes were better plowed, which exits had services open, which rest areas had been cleared. It was the normal chatter that meant things were getting back to routine, the collective intelligence of the trucking community flowing through the airwaves. Oran listened, but didn't key up. He was still processing the night before, still trying to decide if he'd been in danger or if he'd let his imagination run wild. A voice on Channel 19 warned about a jackknifed truck near the summit exit. Another voice confirmed it, adding that traffic was backing up but moving slowly around the accident. Oran made a mental note and adjusted his following distance, giving himself more room to react if traffic suddenly stopped. He passed the accident site around 9:30 a.m. A livestock trailer had gone sideways in the median, its cab tilted at an unnatural angle, cargo scattered across the snow. Emergency vehicles surrounded it, their lights painting the white landscape in strobing red and blue. Oran said a quiet prayer for the driver, hoping they'd walked away from it, knowing from experience that accidents on ice often went bad fast. He'd been lucky this morning, lucky to have Hobart's guidance out of the ranch, lucky to have dry pavement under his chains for most of the drive. Luck was a commodity on the road, and you never knew when yours would run out. Around 10 a.m., he passed a way station on the outskirts of Laramie. The digital sign above the entrance showed green lights for pre-pass-equipped trucks, indicating they could bypass without stopping. Oran's pre-pass transponder was mounted on his windshield, a small black box that was supposed to communicate with the way station sensors and clear him automatically. But lately, the system had been glitching. Sometimes it worked perfectly. Other times it failed for no apparent reason, and getting pulled over for running a green light that should have been red was an expensive mistake. The fine alone could eat into a week's profit, not to mention the delay and the black mark on his safety record. He made the decision to play it safe and take the exit ramp, rolling onto the scale even though his pre-pass light was showing green. Better to waste 5 minutes than risk a citation. The scale registered his weight, and Oran watched the display carefully. Legal. No issues. 42,000 pounds loaded, well under the 80,000-pound federal limit. A voice came over the loudspeaker mounted on a pole near the scale house. Pull to the right and proceed to the inspection area. Oran's stomach tightened. Random inspections were part of the job, an occupational hazard every driver faced, but they always felt like rolling dice. One violation, one problem with his paperwork or his equipment, and he could be sitting here for hours while mechanics went over his truck with microscopic attention to detail. He parked where instructed and killed his engine, taking a moment to collect himself. Through his windshield, he could see the way station office, a low brick building with large windows and a handful of vehicles parked outside. A figure emerged from the building, clipboard in hand, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd done this routine 1,000 times. As the person got closer, Oran could see it was a woman, older, maybe mid-50s, with short gray hair that looked like it had been cut for practicality rather than style. She wore a heavy coat with a reflective vest over it, and her boots crunched through the packed snow with the confidence of someone who'd spent winters in Wyoming and wasn't impressed by cold anymore. Her name tag read Avis Renfro when she reached his window. Oran rolled it down, letting in a blast of cold air that made his eyes water. "Morning," she said, her voice neutral, neither friendly nor hostile, the professional tone of someone who'd learned not to get too personal with the hundreds of drivers who pass through here every week. "Need to see your logbook, registration, and insurance." Oran handed over the documents without comment, watching her face as she flipped through them methodically. Her eyes moved across the pages with practiced efficiency, checking dates and signatures, looking for discrepancies or red flags that would require further investigation. She paused on his logbook, her finger tracing the entries from the previous day. Oran had documented everything carefully during his time at the ranch. The time he'd stopped, the reason for stopping, the location as best as he could describe it, the time he'd started moving again. Documentation was your only defense if questions arose later, if dispatch complained about delays, or if the company's safety department wanted to know why you'd gone off route. "You came through the storm last night," she said. It wasn't a question, more of a statement confirming what she was reading. Orrin nodded. "Got stuck south of Rollins. Had to shelter at a ranch until the road opened." Avis looked up from the clipboard. Her expression still neutral, but something had shifted in her eyes. A flicker of interest, maybe concern, something that suggested his answer had triggered a connection in her mind. "Which ranch?" she asked, and now her voice carried more weight, more focus. Orrin hesitated for a fraction of a second, wondering why the question mattered, why a way station employee would care about the specific location where he'd waited out a storm. But he answered honestly because lying would only create more problems. "About 6 miles south of the highway near mile marker 235. Owner's name was Hobart Lyle." Avis's pen paused on the page. She looked at Orrin more carefully now, her eyes scanning his face like she was trying to read something written there, trying to assess whether he was telling the truth or repeating a rehearsed story. The silence stretched for several seconds, long enough to make Orrin uncomfortable, long enough to make him wonder if he'd said something wrong. Then she set the clipboard down on his step rail, carefully, deliberately, and crossed her arms. The gesture wasn't threatening, but it signaled that this conversation had just shifted from routine inspection to something more serious. "Hobart Lyle," she repeated slowly, as if testing the name on her tongue, seeing how it felt. "Tall guy, older, drives a white pickup with amber lights?" Orrin felt his pulse quicken, that familiar spike of anxiety that came when you realized you might be in trouble but didn't yet know what kind. "Yeah, that's him. You know him?" His voice came out more defensive than he'd intended, and he forced himself to take a breath, to stay calm. Avis studied him for another moment, then seemed to make a decision. She picked up the clipboard again, made a note, then looked back at him with an expression that was harder to read now. "I know of him," she said carefully, choosing her words. "He's helped a few drivers over the years when the road closes. Never heard any complaints, but I've heard questions. Wyoming Highway Patrol asked about him last winter after a driver reported sheltering at his ranch. Said everything was fine, nothing wrong happened, but something about the story didn't sit right with the investigator. They sent a trooper out to check on the property, and Hobart was cooperative, showed them around, answered all their questions. No issues were found, no evidence of wrongdoing, but the trooper filed an interesting note in his report." She paused, and Orrin found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the story despite his growing unease. "The trooper said the barn the driver described seemed bigger on the inside than it should have been, based on the external dimensions, like there might be sections that aren't visible from the outside, or storage areas that aren't part of the main structure. Could mean nothing. Old barns get additions, get modified over the years. But it raised a question that nobody could answer definitively." She let that hang in the air for a moment, watching Orrin's reaction. Orrin's mouth went dry as he thought about the barn where he'd spent the night. He tried to remember the layout, tried to visualize the dimensions. It had seemed straightforward at the time. A large, rectangular structure with farm equipment and open space. But he'd been exhausted, stressed, focused on survival rather than spatial analysis. Had there been sections he hadn't seen? Doors he hadn't noticed? Areas blocked off by equipment or tarps? He couldn't say for certain, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. "What does that mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Avis shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than casual dismissal. "Could mean nothing. Could mean the barn's got sections that aren't visible from the outside, storage areas, or workshops, or who knows what. Could mean there's more going on at that property than a simple cattle operation. I'm not saying Hobart's doing anything illegal. I'm not even saying there's anything suspicious. I'm just saying that when drivers shelter there, sometimes their stories don't quite line up. Little details that don't match from one account to another. Timing that doesn't add up when you really look at it. She flipped through his logbook again, stopping on the previous day's entries. Your logbook shows you stopped at 6 p.m. yesterday and didn't start moving again until 8 a.m. today. That's 14 hours. Long time to sit in a barn, even in a bad storm. Orrin felt defensive suddenly, a surge of emotion that made his face flush despite the cold air coming through the window. He felt like he was being accused of something he couldn't name, judged for decisions he'd made under pressure in circumstances that were impossible to explain to someone who hadn't been there. The storm didn't stop until morning. I couldn't leave before then. The access road wasn't passable. Avis nodded slowly, her expression not quite skeptical, but not entirely accepting either. I'm sure that's true. I'm just noting it for the record. See, we keep track of delays and unusual stops, especially during severe weather events. It's part of how we identify patterns that might indicate problems. Cargo theft, insurance fraud, drivers being coerced or manipulated. Most of the time it's nothing, just drivers making the best decisions they can in bad situations. But sometimes, patterns emerge that suggest something more organized is happening. She closed his logbook and handed it back along with his other documents. You're good to go. Everything's in order. No violations. Just wanted to make sure you knew what you were dealing with out there. Orrin took the documents, his hands not quite steady, his mind racing with implications he didn't want to consider. What aren't you telling me? He asked, unable to stop himself, needing to know even though part of him dreaded the answer. Avis looked at him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind, deciding how much to reveal. Then she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry beyond the cab, creating an intimacy that made the conversation feel more serious, more real. There's a scam that's been running through Wyoming for a few years now. Not just here, other states too, but we've seen evidence of it in this corridor. It targets drivers who get caught in bad weather, especially drivers with high-value loads. Someone flags them down during a storm, offers shelter, takes them off the main highway to a location that's isolated, away from cameras and witnesses. She paused, making sure Orrin was following, making sure he understood the significance of what she was saying. While the driver's sleeping or distracted, a crew shows up. They don't steal the whole load. That would be too obvious. They offload part of the cargo, maybe 10 or 15%, amount small enough that it might be written off as warehouse miscounting or damage during transport. Or they swap documentation, make it look like the seal was broken or the load was compromised. Then they reseal everything so carefully that the driver doesn't notice. Later, when the receiver does inventory and finds a discrepancy, everyone assumes it happened somewhere in the supply chain. Insurance gets filed, claims get paid, and nobody looks too hard at the details. Orrin felt like the ground had dropped out from under him, like he was falling through space with nothing to grab onto. His mind immediately went to the night before, to the 14 hours he'd spent in that barn with no communication, to the voices he thought he'd heard but convinced himself were imagined, to the way Hobart had seemed so helpful, so genuine. Are you saying Hobart Lyle is running that scam? His voice came out rougher than he intended, almost angry, though he wasn't sure if the anger was directed at Hobart or at himself for being potentially duped. Avis shook her head, but her expression remained serious. I'm saying I don't know. I'm saying there's been suspicious activity in this area, and Hobart's name has come up more than once in connection with drivers who've had unexplained delays or minor cargo discrepancies. But nothing's been proven, no charges have been filed, no arrests made. The Wyoming Highway Patrol has investigated multiple times and never found sufficient evidence to move forward. Could be coincidence. Could be that Hobart's just a helpful guy who gets unlucky with the drivers he assists. Could be something else entirely. She straightened up, creating distance again, returning to her professional demeanor. I just think drivers should know there are risks out there beyond bad weather. You made it through the storm, that's what matters. But when you get to your delivery, I'd recommend asking for a full inventory count before they start unloading. If there's a discrepancy, you want to catch it immediately, while the trail is still fresh. Document everything. Take photos of your seals before they're broken. Get signatures from the receiver. Protect yourself, because if something's wrong, you don't want to be caught in the middle of an insurance investigation 6 months from now. With that, she stepped back from the truck and gestured toward the exit. Like I said, you're good to go. Drive safe. Orrin wanted to ask more questions, wanted to demand specifics about what exactly had happened to other drivers, wanted names and dates and details that would help him understand whether he was in danger. But Avis had already turned away, walking back toward the way station office, her boots crunching through the snow with the same confident rhythm as before. The conversation was over, at least as far as she was concerned. Orrin sat frozen in his seat for nearly a minute, his mind racing, trying to process everything he'd just learned. He thought about the barn, about Hobart, about the way the rancher had approached him on the highway with perfect timing, perfect knowledge of the road closure, perfect motivation to seem helpful. He thought about the night he'd spent there, about the sounds he'd heard, about the coffee and sandwiches Hobart had brought. Had any of it been real, or had it all been theater, carefully staged to keep him calm and compliant while something else happened in the dark? He climbed down from the cab, his legs unsteady, and walked to the back of his trailer. The snow crunched under his boots, and the wind bit at his exposed face, but he barely noticed. He pulled out his flashlight even though it was full daylight now, needing to see clearly, needing to check for himself. He examined the door seals with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The seals had his company's marks, blue and white plastic tags with serial numbers that matched his paperwork. He checked the numbers against his bill of lading, confirming each digit. They matched. The locks looked untouched, the hasps secure, the metal showing no signs of forced entry or manipulation. But that didn't mean nothing had happened. Orrin knew enough about cargo fraud from safety briefings and industry newsletters to know that sophisticated operations didn't break seals, they copied them. They had equipment that could read the serial numbers, printers that could reproduce the plastic tags with perfect fidelity, skills that came from years of practice and refinement. They were professionals, and professionals didn't leave obvious evidence. He pulled out his phone and started taking photos from multiple angles. Close-ups of the seals, wide shots of the entire door assembly, pictures of the trailer number and the company logo. He documented everything he could think of, building a record that would protect him if questions arose later. When he was satisfied he'd captured enough images, he climbed back into his cab and sat there for another minute, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He needed to call his dispatcher, needed to report what he'd learned, but he didn't want to sound paranoid or alarmist. The load was probably fine. The seals looked intact. He'd likely gotten worked up over nothing. But Avis's warning kept echoing in his mind, her careful phrasing suggesting she knew more than she was saying, her concern for his well-being seeming genuine despite the professional distance she maintained. He pulled out his phone and dialed dispatch. The line rang twice before connecting. "Dispatch, this is Monica." Her voice sounded harried, like she was juggling multiple calls and problems simultaneously. Orrin took a breath and tried to sound calm, professional, not like a driver who'd spent the night in an isolated barn possibly being set up for insurance fraud. "Monica, it's Orrin. I need to report a potential security issue with yesterday's delay." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of typing stopping. What kind of security issue? Her voice had shifted, become more focused. Oran explained the situation, keeping it factual, avoiding speculation. The storm, the ranch, the night in the barn, the conversation with Avis at the way station. He laid out the facts as clearly as he could, letting Monica draw her own conclusions rather than trying to convince her of anything. When he finished, there was another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Monica said slowly, and Oren could almost hear her thinking through the implications. "Here's what we're going to do. You proceed to North Platte as planned. When you get there, before they start unloading, you ask the receiver to do a full inventory count. Not just a piece count, but a detailed check against the manifest. If anything's missing or damaged, we need to know immediately, while you're still on site. I'll file a report with our security department right now, and I'll contact our insurance company to give them a heads up. Did you get the rancher's full name and contact information?" Oren felt his stomach sink as he realized the extent of his failure to gather basic information. "I got his name, Hobart Lyle, and a general location, but no phone number, no physical address beyond 6 miles south of mile marker 235. I didn't think to ask for more at the time." The admission felt like a confession of incompetence, proof that he'd been so focused on surviving the storm that he'd abandoned basic security protocols. Monica made a sound that could have been frustration or sympathy. It was hard to tell over the phone. "Okay, well, that's something at least. I'll pass it along to security, and they can work with local law enforcement if needed. Just get to North Platte, get the load checked, and keep your phone on. If there's a problem, we'll deal with it. If there's not, we'll chalk this up to bad weather and an abundance of caution." She paused, and her voice softened slightly. "And Oren? Next time you're in a situation like that, try to get more information. Name, number, license plate, photos if you can do it safely. Something we can trace if things go sideways." The call ended, and Oren sat holding his phone, feeling worse than before he'd called. He'd done everything Monica asked, but it felt inadequate, insufficient to address the gnawing anxiety in his gut. He pulled out of the way station and back onto I-80, merging into traffic that had picked up speed now that the storm's immediate aftermath was clearing. The highway ahead stretched toward Nebraska, familiar and endless, but it no longer felt like neutral territory. It felt like a gauntlet he had to run, every mile bringing him closer to the moment when he'd learn whether his load was intact or whether he'd been played. 6 months passed before Oren found himself heading back through Wyoming. It was September now, early fall, when the weather could shift from clear skies to snow in a matter of hours, but usually gave you enough warning to plan around it. The aspens were starting to turn gold in the high country, and the air had that crisp quality that came with shorter days and longer nights. Oren had been avoiding I-80 through that stretch when he could, taking longer routes through Colorado or Montana, adding hours and miles to his trips, burning extra fuel that cut into his already thin profit margins. He told dispatch he had personal reasons for the detours, and they'd complained about the extra costs but hadn't pushed too hard. Drivers had their quirks, their superstitions, their stretches of highway they refused to run for reasons they couldn't always articulate. But this load didn't give him a choice. Time-sensitive pharmaceutical shipment, Sacramento to Omaha, premium rate if delivered within 48 hours. Penalty clauses if it was late. The only route that made the delivery window was straight through Wyoming, straight through the corridor where everything had happened back in March. Oren had stared at the route map on his tablet for 10 minutes before accepting the load, his finger tracing the line of I-80 through Rawlins and Laramie, past the spot where Hobart had flagged him down, past the way station where Avis had planted seeds of doubt that had grown into a forest of paranoia over the following months. He'd called the dispatch 3 times trying to negotiate an alternate route, suggesting he could run south through Colorado and pick up I-80 in Nebraska, avoiding Wyoming entirely. But the dispatcher had been firm. The pharmaceutical company had specific requirements about transit time and temperature control, and the southern route added 12 hours that would blow the delivery window and void the premium rate. "It's a straight shot, Oren," the dispatcher had said, her voice carrying the tired patience of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "Clear weather forecast. No construction delays. You'll be through Wyoming in 6 hours. Take the load, or I'll give it to someone else." So he'd taken it. He'd picked up the pharmaceuticals at a secured warehouse in Sacramento just after midnight, spent an hour doing his pre-trip inspection with more care than usual, checking every seal, every strap, every lock twice, and then a third time for good measure. The load was valuable, close to $2 million in prescription medications bound for a regional distribution center that supplied hospitals and pharmacies across Nebraska and Iowa. The kind of load that made you check your mirrors more often, that made you choose your parking spots carefully, that kept you from sleeping too soundly even when you were exhausted. He'd left Sacramento at midnight, made good time through Nevada and Utah, and crossed into Wyoming just after sunrise. The landscape looked different in fall light compared to the winter white he remembered from March. The browns and golds of dried grass replaced the snow, and the sky was that deep blue you only saw in high-altitude western states, so clear and vast it made you feel small and exposed. I-80 stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, traffic light, conditions perfect. Oren kept his speed at 65 and his mind focused on the road, trying not to think about the barn 6 miles south of mile marker 235, trying not to scan every turnout for white pickups with amber lights. But he couldn't help it. The human brain was wired to remember threats, to catalog dangers and watch for their return. Every mile that passed brought him closer to the spot where he'd made the decision to follow Hobart off the highway, and the closer he got, the more his stomach tightened. His hands were clamped on the wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache. His jaw was set so tight he could feel the beginning of a headache forming behind his eyes. He'd rolled through dangerous situations before, driven through worse weather, hauled more valuable loads. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way he couldn't quite explain. Around 10 a.m., as Oren approached Rollins, he found himself slowing down involuntarily, his foot easing off the throttle as if his body was preparing for something his conscious mind hadn't fully acknowledged. He checked his mirrors more frequently now, scanning for vehicles that might be following him, for patterns that might suggest coordination. A blue sedan had been pacing him for the last 10 miles, staying 3 car lengths back in the right lane, matching his speed with mechanical precision. Probably just another driver using cruise control, Oren told himself. Probably nothing. But the sedan's presence made his pulse quicken anyway. The Sinclair station where other trucks had sheltered during the March storm appeared on his right, and Oren felt a pang of something like regret mixed with vindication. If he'd stopped there instead of pushing on into the storm, none of the uncertainty would have happened. He'd have lost a day waiting out the weather, but he'd have avoided the night in the barn, avoided the questions that had followed him ever since. But he also might have avoided learning something important about how the road really worked, about the predators that operated in the margins between help and harm. Knowledge had a cost, and he'd paid it. He passed the turnoff for the ranch access road without incident. No vehicles were parked on the shoulder. No one was flagging down trucks. Nothing that suggested Hobart was out there doing what Pearl Vandiver claimed he did. Just empty highway and empty plains, and the ghost of a memory that felt less real with every mile. The blue sedan had taken an exit somewhere behind him, replaced now by a silver SUV that seemed to be in no hurry. Traffic patterns, Oren reminded himself. just normal traffic patterns. Not everything was a conspiracy. Not every vehicle was a threat. Oren started to relax slightly, his shoulders dropping from their hunched position, his breathing deepening as the immediate danger zone passed behind him. Maybe this trip would be uneventful. Maybe the fear had been in his head all along, a phantom born from one strange night and fed by warnings from people who might have had their own agendas. He was overthinking it, reading threats into ordinary circumstances, letting paranoia poison what should have been a routine run. Then his CB crackled to life, and Oren's brief moment of relaxation shattered like glass. Eastbound rig with the white trailer. You've got a trailer tire smoking near your rear axle. Might want to pull over and check it before it goes. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the flat accent of the high plains. It sounded helpful, concerned, exactly like a fellow driver doing a courtesy call. But Oren's heart rate spiked immediately. His training and experience and the accumulated paranoia of 6 months colliding in his chest. He checked his mirrors carefully, looking for smoke, for any visual confirmation of the warning. His trailer had a white roof and sides, making it highly visible in the morning sun. He could see the rear axles clearly, see the tires rotating normally, see no discoloration or haze that would indicate overheating. His tire pressure monitoring system, a sophisticated sensor array he'd installed after a blowout 2 years ago, had cost him 3 days and $2,000 in repairs, showed all tires within normal pressure ranges. No alerts, no warnings, no indication of any problem. He keyed up the CB, keeping his voice neutral, professional. Eastbound with white trailer. I'm not seeing any smoke. Can you give me your location and vehicle type? His eyes scanned the highway around him, looking for the source of the call. There were maybe 6 other vehicles visible. 3 trucks ahead of him, spread across both lanes, 2 cars behind, and 1 pickup in the left lane about to pass. Any of them could have made the call, or none of them. CB range was unpredictable, could carry for miles under the right atmospheric conditions. A pause on the CB, longer than you'd expect if someone was just responding to a simple question. Then the voice came back. Different now, more cautious, less certain. My mistake, brother. Must have been the rig ahead of you. The angle was wrong from where I am. Disregard. The transmission ended with a click, and the channel went silent except for the faint background static that was always present. Oren's hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles turned white. The exchange felt familiar. Too familiar. Like déjà vu layered with dread. A fake mechanical issue designed to get him to pull over, then a quick correction when he questioned it. It was a classic con, a technique used by cargo thieves and hijackers, documented in safety bulletins and warned about in driver training seminars. Make the target think they have a problem that requires immediate attention. Get them isolated on a shoulder or in a turnout, then move in when they're vulnerable and distracted. It was the same playbook Luther Pritchard had used on Deacon Woolridge in that story every driver seemed to know. The one that circulated through truck stops and online forums like a campfire tale with the ring of truth. And it was happening again. Right here. Right now, on the same stretch of highway where Hobart had flagged him down 6 months ago. The same territory, the same tactics, possibly the same crew. Coincidence felt unlikely. This felt deliberate, targeted, like someone had been waiting for him to come back. Oren didn't pull over. He kept his speed steady at 65 and scanned every vehicle around him with renewed intensity, trying to identify threats, trying to see patterns in the seemingly random flow of traffic. The pickup that had been passing him in the left lane suddenly slowed, dropping back to pace him instead of completing its pass. That was wrong. When you started a pass on the highway, you committed to it. You didn't abort halfway and fall back into formation. The behavior was unnatural, deliberate. the kind of thing that happened when vehicles were coordinating. A blue sedan appeared in his mirrors, coming up fast in the right lane. Oren watched it approach, trying to see the driver's face, but the windshield reflected too much sunlight. The sedan pulled alongside him, staying in his blind spot for longer than normal traffic patterns would explain. 30 seconds passed. 45. A full minute. The sedan just sat there, neither passing nor falling back, maintaining perfect parallel position. Oren adjusted his speed, slowing to 60 to see if the sedan would respond. It did, slowing with him, maintaining the same relative position. He accelerated back to 65. The sedan matched him. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Oren's CB crackled again. Different voice this time, female, older. Eastbound traffic near mile marker 250. Be advised there's debris in the right lane ahead. Looks like truck tire tread. Watch yourselves. Oren's eyes snapped to the road ahead, scanning for the debris. He didn't see anything. No black rubber chunks, no hazards visible on the clean pavement. Another false call, another attempt to manipulate behavior, another piece of the pattern falling into place. His phone rang, the sound cutting through his focus like an alarm. He glanced at the screen mounted on his dash. Unknown number 307 area code. Wyoming. Every instinct screamed at him not to answer, but what if it was legitimate? What if it was the state patrol or dispatch, or the pharmaceutical company checking on the delivery? He couldn't afford to ignore potentially important calls. He hit the accept button, putting it on speaker. "This is Oren." The voice that came back was female, professional, speaking quickly with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. "Mr. Kincaid, this is Avis Renfro from the Laramie Way Station. Don't stop your truck for any reason between Rollins and Laramie. We've had reports of a crew operating in that area today, using CB calls to flag down trucks. State Patrol is responding, but they're 20 minutes out from your position. Just keep moving until you're past Elk Mountain." Oren felt ice flood his veins, cold spreading from his chest out to his limbs. His worst fears were being confirmed in real time by someone who had no reason to lie to him. "What kind of crew?" he asked, his voice tight, controlled despite the adrenaline dump making his hands shake slightly. "What are they after?" Avis's voice carried the weight of someone delivering bad news they'd delivered too many times. "We don't have all the details yet, but it matches the pattern I told you about in March. False mechanical warnings on CB, vehicles coordinating to box in targets, offers of help that lead to isolated locations. One truck reported being followed after ignoring a CB call about a smoking tire. That was 10 minutes ago, eastbound near mile marker 245. The driver said 2 vehicles were working together, one ahead and one behind, trying to force him into a turnout. He managed to stay on the highway and they backed off, but we think they're still active in the area looking for another target." Oren's mind raced, connecting dots with sickening clarity. Mile marker 245 was 5 miles behind him. The smoking tire call had come through maybe 8 minutes ago. He was the next target. They'd tried the same tactic on the previous driver and it hadn't worked, so they'd moved on to him. "They already made contact," Oren said. "CB call about a smoking tire maybe 10 minutes ago. I questioned it and they backed off, said it was a mistake. But I've got vehicles pacing me now. Blue sedan in my blind spot. Pickup that started to pass then dropped back. Could be nothing, could be them." He heard Avis curse quietly on the other end, the professional facade cracking slightly to reveal genuine concern. "Okay, listen carefully. Do not acknowledge any more CB calls unless you can verify the source. Do not pull over for any reason. If vehicles try to box you in, stay calm and hold your lane. They're counting on you to panic or to be cooperative. Don't give them either. I'm contacting State Patrol right now to give them your exact position and vehicle description. They'll try to get a unit to you as fast as possible, but in the meantime, you keep your wheels turning and you stay on that highway." The call ended, and Orrin immediately checked his mirrors again. The blue sedan was still there, still holding position in his blind spot like a remora attached to a shark. The pickup ahead had drifted closer, now only about 50 yards in front of his bumper, its speed decreasing gradually. Orrin recognized the tactic immediately from safety briefings. It was called a rolling roadblock, a technique where one vehicle slowed traffic from the front while others maneuvered around the target, creating a controlled environment where the mark had limited options and reduced visibility to other drivers. He grabbed his CB mic and switched to Channel 9, the emergency frequency monitored by law enforcement and emergency services. "This is an eastbound commercial vehicle at mile marker 252 on I-80, requesting immediate State Patrol assistance. I'm being followed by multiple vehicles that appear to be coordinating an intercept. Blue sedan and white pickup. I've received credible information about cargo theft activity in this area. Request confirmation of law enforcement presence and ETA." Static answered him for several seconds. Then a voice came through, male, official sounding. "Eastbound driver, this is Wyoming Highway Patrol. We copy your transmission and have units responding to your location. Can you provide your truck number and company name for identification?" Orrin rattled off the information, feeling a small measure of relief that someone official was now aware of his situation. "ETA on responding units is approximately 15 minutes. In the meantime, maintain your current speed and stay on the highway. Do not stop for any reason. If vehicles attempt to force you off the road, use your horn and maintain your lane. We're tracking your position now." 15 minutes. That was an eternity when you were being hunted. Orrin did the math quickly. At 65 miles per hour, he'd cover about 16 miles in 15 minutes, which would put him past Elk Mountain and closer to Laramie. But 16 miles of highway with hostile vehicles coordinating around him felt like navigating a minefield. Every second stretched, every mile marker that passed felt like a small victory that could be snatched away at any moment. The white pickup ahead of him tapped its brakes, red lights flashing briefly. Orrin maintained his distance, refusing to close the gap. The pickup braked again, harder this time, forcing Orrin to slow to 55 to avoid rear-ending it. This was the game they were playing, trying to control his speed, trying to create the conditions they needed. Orrin checked his left mirror. The passing lane was clear for the moment. He signaled, checked again, then moved left to pass the pickup. As soon as he committed to the pass, a dark SUV appeared in his mirrors, accelerating hard in the left lane behind him. Orrin saw it coming and made another split-second decision. Instead of completing the pass, he aborted and moved back into the right lane, tucking in behind the white pickup again. The SUV shot past in the left lane, then cut in front of him hard enough that Orrin had to brake to avoid a collision. Now he had the pickup ahead and the SUV also ahead, but in the left lane, both of them slowing, both of them working together to control the traffic pattern around him. The blue sedan was still in his right blind spot, and now a fourth vehicle had appeared, a gray pickup pulling up behind him. Orrin was boxed in completely, trapped in a diamond formation with limited options, his heart hammered in his chest, his mouth dry, his hands slick with sweat despite the cab's cool air. This was it. This was the moment where he either escaped or became another statistic, another driver who'd disappeared into the insurance investigation system. A rest area appeared on the right, a paved turnout with restrooms and picnic tables, currently empty of other vehicles. The SUV ahead of him signaled right, as if planning to exit. Orrin understood immediately what they wanted. They were trying to herd him into the rest area, away from traffic, away from witnesses, into a controlled environment where they could work without interruption. His CB crackled. "Eastbound rig, you should probably take this rest area. Your trailer's looking really unstable back there. Swaying pretty bad. I think you've got a load shift issue." The voice was calm, helpful, concerned. Exactly the tone you'd use if you were genuinely worried about another driver's safety. But Oren knew better now. He keyed up his mic eeg, broadcasting on Channel 9 where the State Patrol could hear him. "This is the eastbound commercial vehicle at mile marker 252. 4 vehicles are now attempting to force me into a rest area, using false mechanical warnings on CB. I am not stopping, I repeat, I am not stopping, requesting immediate assistance." The gray pickup behind him started flashing its high beams, the universal signal for, "There's something wrong with your vehicle." The blue sedan finally moved, pulling ahead on the right, then cutting in front of him, giving him no choice but to brake hard or hit it. Oren's trailer wobbled as he slowed to 40, the weight of the pharmaceutical cargo shifting slightly, but the brakes held and the rig stayed in its lane. The rest area entrance flashed past on his right. Oren kept his hands locked on the wheel and his eyes forward, refusing to take the bait. The SUV that had been ahead suddenly slowed dramatically, hazard lights flashing. Brake lights glowed red, and Oren watched his following distance evaporate as the SUV decelerated from 40 to 30 to 20 miles per hour. This was a critical moment. If Oren maintained his speed, he'd rear-end the SUV and become legally liable for the accident. His career potentially over. His CDL in jeopardy. If he stopped, he'd be vulnerable to whatever they had planned. His only option was to change lanes, but the left lane was occupied by the white pickup pacing the SUV, creating a wall. Oren made a decision that went against every safety instinct he'd developed over 8 years of driving. He moved left anyway, forcing his truck into the gap between the SUV and the pickup, using his rig's mass and size to claim space that technically wasn't there. His bumper came within inches of the pickup's rear quarter panel. Horns blared around him. The pickup swerved slightly, giving him room it hadn't intended to give. Oren punched the throttle, and the diesel engine roared, black smoke pouring from his stacks as he muscled his way past the obstruction. For a brief moment, he thought he was clear. The road ahead opened up, traffic pattern breaking apart as his aggressive maneuver disrupted their coordination. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A maintenance turnout appeared on the right about a quarter-mile ahead, and a white pickup with an amber light bar was parked there, nose out, positioned perfectly to intercept him. Even from this distance, Oren recognized it. Same profile, same configuration as Hobart's truck. Could be coincidence, could be a different vehicle entirely, but Oren's gut told him it wasn't. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911 with one hand while steering with the other. A dangerous move, but necessary. The call connected immediately. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was female, young, professionally calm. Oren forced his words out clear and fast, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. I'm a commercial truck driver on I-80 eastbound near mile marker 254. I'm being followed by multiple vehicles that are attempting to force me off the highway. White pickup, blue sedan, dark SUV, gray pickup. They're coordinating their movements. There's another white pickup with amber lights parked in a turnout ahead that appears to be part of the operation. I need State Patrol immediately. The dispatcher asked him to confirm his location, and he repeated it, adding his truck number, company name, and a description of his trailer. She told him units were en route, already aware of his situation from his CB transmissions, ETA now less than 10 minutes. Stay on the line with me, Mr. Kincaid. Keep your doors locked, maintain your speed, and do not stop for anyone except a marked law enforcement vehicle. Can you describe the vehicles around you in more detail? Oran did his best, rattling off colors and approximate makes, but his attention was split between the phone and the road ahead, where the white pickup with the light bar was waiting. As he got closer, the pickup pulled out of the turnout and merged onto the highway ahead of him, accelerating to match his speed. Now he had hostile vehicles ahead, behind, and on both sides. The formation was complete, the trap set, and Oren was running out of highway before they forced him into whatever endgame they had planned. Through his windshield, Oren could see the driver of the white pickup ahead, a tall figure in a dark jacket. From this distance and angle, he couldn't see the face clearly, but something about the posture, the way the man held himself, triggered recognition. His mind flashed back to March, to Hobart standing in the snow, flagging him down, to the rancher's weathered face and helpful manner. Was this the same man? Or was his traumatized brain seeing connections that weren't there? The white pickup ahead started slowing again, brake lights glowing, forcing Oren to reduce speed. Behind him, the gray pickup closed the gap, tailgating so close that Oren couldn't see its headlights in his mirrors. The blue sedan and the SUV bracketed him on the left, creating a rolling cage. Oren's speed dropped from 60 to 50 to 40, and he knew that once he got below 30, they'd have him. At low speeds, his truck's mass advantage disappeared, and their maneuverability would dominate. They could block him completely, force him to stop, and then whatever they'd planned would unfold. "They're boxing me in," Oren said into the phone, his voice tight. "Reducing my speed, blocking passing options. I'm down to 40 miles per hour and dropping." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, a lifeline of professional competence in the chaos. "State Patrol is 8 minutes out. A helicopter is being dispatched from Cheyenne, ETA 12 minutes. Air support will have eyes on you shortly. Keep me updated on your speed and position." 8 minutes. Oran did the math. At his current rate of deceleration, he'd be below 20 miles per hour in 3 minutes, maybe stopped completely in 5. The patrol wouldn't reach him in time. He needed to do something now, needed to break the pattern, needed to create an opportunity that didn't exist in the current equation. His eyes scanned the highway ahead, looking for options, for anything he could use. A turnout appeared on the right, a paved area barely big enough for 2 cars, marked with a maintenance access sign. It was small, tight, completely unsuitable for a semi-truck and trailer, which meant they wouldn't expect him to use it. Oran made another split-second decision, one that went against everything he'd been told, everything he'd planned. He cranked the wheel right and hit the brakes hard, tires barking as he fought to keep the trailer from jackknifing. The truck shuddered and slewed sideways, the trailer's momentum carrying it toward the ditch before the brakes finally bit and brought everything to a shuddering stop. He'd pulled into the tiny turnout at an angle, blocking most of it, his trailer hanging partially into the right lane. It was a terrible parking job, dangerous and probably illegal, but it accomplished one critical thing. He was stopped in a position where the highway patrol would see him immediately when they arrived. He was visible, exposed, impossible to miss, and most importantly, he was no longer moving, which meant the crew pursuing him couldn't herd him any further from help. The white pickup ahead had continued past, apparently not expecting Oran's sudden move. It began to reverse on the shoulder, coming back toward him. The gray pickup behind had also passed, but was now backing up. The blue sedan and SUV had pulled onto the shoulder ahead, and Oren could see figures emerging from the vehicles. His position was terrible from a defensive standpoint, but at least he'd stopped the rolling entrapment. Now it was a standoff. "I've stopped in a maintenance turnout at mile marker 254, Oren told the dispatcher, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "Multiple subjects are now approaching my vehicle on foot. I'm locked in my cab with engine running. Doors are secured. I do not know what their intentions are, but I am not exiting this vehicle." Through his windshield, Oren watched the white pickup complete its reverse and pull into the turnout about 30 yards ahead, positioning itself to block any forward escape. The driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. Even at this distance, even with 6 months of memory distortion, Oren recognized him. It was Hobart Lyle, the rancher who'd helped him during the March storm, the man who'd offered shelter and coffee, and whose motives Oren had questioned ever since, was standing right there, walking toward his truck with the same purposeful but unhurried gait. Oren's mind reeled, trying to process what this meant. Was Hobart part of the crew? Had he been part of it all along, and the March incident had been a trial run, a way to gather information? Or was this something else? Some bizarre coincidence that Oren's paranoid mind was interpreting as conspiracy. He didn't have time to figure it out. Hobart reached his driver's door and knocked on the window, the sound sharp and deliberate in the sudden quiet. Oren cracked the window an inch, keeping his hand on the door lock, his phone still connected to 911. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice carrying more authority than he felt. "State Patrol is on the way. They'll be here in minutes." He could hear the dispatcher's voice through his phone speaker, calm instructions to stay in the vehicle, not to engage, to wait for law enforcement. Hobart's face appeared at the window gap, and up close, Oren could see that the man looked different from his memory. Older, more tired, with lines around his eyes that spoke of stress rather than just weather exposure. But the voice was the same when he spoke, that same flat Wyoming accent, the same tone that had sounded so helpful 6 months ago. "Oren, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're in danger. These people following you, they're not who you think they are. You need to come with me right now before the situation gets worse." The words were so unexpected, so contrary to what Oren had assumed, that for a moment he couldn't process them. "What? You're telling me I'm in danger? You're part of this." He gestured at the vehicles surrounding him, at the people now standing near their cars watching the interaction. Hobart shook his head, his expression urgent, almost pleading. "I know how this looks, but you've got it backwards. I'm not working with them. I've been tracking them. These are the people who've been running the cargo theft ring, and when I found out they were targeting you today, I tried to intercept." Oren's mind spun, trying to recalibrate everything he thought he knew. "That's insane. Avis Renfrew told me about the scam. Pearl Vandiver told me you were running it. The Highway Patrol investigated you." Hobart's face tightened at the mention of those names. Avis means well, but she doesn't have the full picture, and Pearl— He paused, pain flickering across his features. Pearl has her reasons for saying what she says, but they're personal, not factual. The truth is more complicated than either of them told you. Behind Hobart, Oren could see the other figures getting back into their vehicles. The blue sedan started moving, pulling away from the shoulder and accelerating eastbound. Then the SUV followed, and the gray pickup. Within 30 seconds, all of them were gone, disappearing into traffic as if they'd never been there. Only Hobart's white pickup remained, parked ahead of Oren's truck. "Why are they leaving?" Oren asked, suspicion thick in his voice. Hobart glanced over his shoulder at the departing vehicles, then back at Oren. "Because they know the patrol is coming. They're not going to stick around to be identified. This whole thing was an attempt to intercept you before you reached Laramie, but now that you've stopped and called it in, they're cutting their losses." He stepped back from the window slightly. "Oren, I'm going to stand right here until the patrol arrives so you can tell them everything. But you need to understand something. The story you've been told about what happened in March, about what I do, it's not accurate. And when this is over, when you've got law enforcement here and you feel safe, I hope you'll give me a chance to explain." Before Oren could respond, he saw flashing lights appear in his mirrors, red and blue cutting through the distance, growing rapidly larger. 2 Wyoming Highway Patrol cruisers were approaching at high speed, one in each lane, lights blazing, sirens audible now through the closed windows. They pulled up behind Oren's truck and ahead of Hobart's pickup, boxing the scene in, and officers emerged quickly, hands on their weapons, approaching with the careful caution of professionals responding to a potentially dangerous situation. One officer approached Hobart first, and Oren watched through his window as the rancher raised his hands slowly, making no sudden moves, speaking calmly to the trooper. Another officer approached Oren's door, a young man with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to take nothing at face value. He motioned for Oren to roll down his window fully, and Oren complied, finally feeling safe enough to break the seal of his cab. "Mr. Kincaid?" the officer asked. "I'm Trooper Bain. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Oren shook his head, his voice coming out rougher than he expected. "I'm okay, shaken up but not hurt. There were 4 vehicles coordinating around me, trying to force me off the highway. They all left about 2 minutes ago except for that white pickup." He pointed at Hobart's truck. "The driver claims he's trying to help me, but I don't know what to believe anymore." Trooper Bain nodded, making notes in a small pad. "We're going to sort this out. First thing, I need you to stay in your vehicle while we secure the scene and identify everyone involved. We've got descriptions of the vehicles that fled, and we're coordinating with units down the highway to try to locate them. You did exactly the right thing by calling 911 and refusing to stop for them. That probably saved you from a very bad situation." Over the next hour, as more patrol units arrived and the scene became a hive of official activity, Oren gave his statement multiple times to different officers. He described the CB calls, the vehicles surrounding him, the way they'd coordinated to box him in. He mentioned the March incident with Hobart, the warnings from Avis and Pearl, the months of paranoia and uncertainty, and he described Hobart's claim that he wasn't part of the crew but was tracking them, a claim that seemed designed to sow confusion and create doubt. While Oren was giving his statement, he watched the troopers interview Hobart. The rancher stood beside his pickup, gesturing occasionally, his body language open and cooperative. At one point, one of the troopers opened Hobart's truck and pulled out what looked like a laptop or tablet. They spent several minutes looking at whatever was on the screen, and Oren saw the trooper's expression change from skeptical to interested. Eventually, Trooper Bain returned to Oren's truck. "Mr. Kincaid, we need to ask you some questions about Hobart Lyle. When you encountered him in March, did he ever ask you about your cargo? Did he show unusual interest in your trailer or your paperwork?" Oren thought back, trying to remember details from a night that seemed like years ago now. He asked if I needed anything, if the heat in the barn was enough, if I wanted food, but he never asked about my load specifically. He never went near my trailer that I saw. Trooper Bain nodded, making more notes. "And when he approached you today, what exactly did he say?" Oren recounted the conversation as accurately as he could. Hobart's claim that he was tracking the crew, that Oren was in danger, that the story he'd been told was incomplete. Bain's expression was unreadable as he listened. When Oren finished, the trooper was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Kincaid, I'm going to tell you something that's part of an ongoing investigation, but given your involvement, you have a right to know. Hobart Lyle has been working as an informal cooperating individual with our cargo theft task force for the past 18 months. He's not law enforcement, he's not officially employed by any agency, but he's been providing information about suspicious activity on I-80 through this corridor. The reason he was out here today is because he'd received information that a crew was planning to target a pharmaceutical load, and he was trying to provide advance warning. Oren felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like everything he thought he understood had been inverted. But Avis said, and Pearl said, everyone was warning me about him. Bane nodded. I know. And from their perspective, their warnings were justified based on the information they had. Avis sees patterns in delay reports and makes logical inferences. Pearl has personal history that colors her view. Neither of them knew that Hobart had approached us after his divorce and offered to help track the people he suspected were using his property as a staging area during his marriage. We couldn't give him any official status, but we accepted his information, and so far it's been accurate. The trooper paused, letting that sink in. The crew that was pursuing you today matches descriptions from 3 previous incidents. We've never been able to catch them in the act because they're extremely cautious. They abort at the first sign of law enforcement, they change vehicles frequently, and they seem to have access to cargo manifests and scheduling information. Today was the closest we've come to an interception, and it's because Hobart gave us advance warning that allowed us to position units in the area. Oren's mind reeled, trying to recalibrate 6 months of assumptions and fears. So, the night in March, he really was just helping me. There was no scam, no crew working on my trailer. Bane's expression softened slightly. As far as we can determine, yes. Your load was intact, your seals were genuine, nothing was compromised. But we understand why you were suspicious. The circumstances looked bad, and the warnings you received afterward seemed to confirm your worst fears. That's why these crews are so effective. They operate in an environment of existing suspicion and paranoia, and they use that to their advantage. He closed his notebook and looked at Oren directly. Here's what's going to happen next. We need you to continue to your delivery in Omaha as planned. When you get there, request a full inventory count witnessed by law enforcement. We're coordinating with Nebraska State Patrol to have someone present. If your load is intact, which we believe it will be, that closes this incident. If there's any discrepancy, we need to know immediately. Either way, you're going to be contacted by an FBI agent who specializes in cargo theft. They'll want a detailed statement about both incidents, March and today. Oren nodded numbly, still trying to process everything. Can I talk to Hobart? I feel like I owe him an apology or an explanation or something. Bane considered this, then nodded. I'll ask him, but understand that he's been living under suspicion for 18 months, taking accusations from people who don't know the full story, all because he's trying to help us catch the people who were using his property without his knowledge. He might not want to have that conversation. But Hobart did agree to talk. 5 minutes later, the rancher walked over to Oren's truck, moving slowly, giving Oren time to prepare himself. When he reached the window, Hobart didn't smile, didn't offer any false warmth. He just stood there, waiting. Oren didn't know where to start. I'm sorry, he said finally. For assuming you were part of something you weren't. Hobart shook his head. Don't apologize. You made reasonable inferences based on the information available to you. That's what smart people do. The problem isn't with you, it's with the situation that created the ambiguity. He glanced back at the highway where traffic was flowing normally now, as if this entire incident had never happened. After my divorce, after I realized what had been happening on my property during my marriage, I tried to make it right. I couldn't undo what had already been done, but I could help prevent it from happening again. So I worked with the highway patrol, shared what I knew, watched for patterns. When I heard they were targeting a pharmaceutical load today, I knew it had to be you. There aren't many trucks running that kind of cargo through here on a Friday. Why didn't you just call the police? Oren asked. Why try to intercept me yourself? Hobart's expression turned rueful. because I was trying to warn you before they made contact. I thought if I could reach you first, give you a heads up, you'd be prepared. But my timing was off, and when I saw their vehicles already positioned around you, I had to improvise. I'm not trained for this. I'm just a rancher trying to clean up a mess I didn't make but feel responsible for anyway." Oren wanted to say something profound, something that would acknowledge the strange path that had brought them to this moment. But all he managed was, "Thank you, for the help in March and for today." Hobart nodded, then turned and walked back to his pickup. He climbed in, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway heading west. Within moments, he was just another vehicle in the flow, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others using this road. The rest of the drive to Omaha felt surreal, like Oran was moving through a dream or watching himself from outside his body. The highway patrol escorted him all the way to the Nebraska state line, then handed him off to Nebraska State Patrol, who shadowed him the remaining distance to Omaha. When he reached the pharmaceutical distribution center, there were 2 patrol cars already waiting, along with representatives from the company's security department and the insurance company. The inventory count took 3 hours. They checked every box, every seal, every piece of documentation. When they finished, everything was accounted for. Not a single item was missing, not a single seal was compromised. The load was perfect, intact, exactly as it should have been. The security director shook Oran's hand and told him he'd done an exceptional job protecting the shipment under difficult circumstances. The insurance rep said they'd be putting a commendation in his file. But Oren didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted, wrung out, like he'd survived something that had left invisible scars. That night, parked at a truck stop outside Omaha, he sat in his cab and thought about everything that had happened. About Hobart, who'd been trying to help all along but had been painted as a threat by people who didn't know the whole story. About Avis and Pearl, who'd given warnings based on partial information and reasonable suspicion. About himself, and how he'd spent 6 months living in fear of something that turned out to be the opposite of what he'd thought. The reality was messier than any simple narrative could capture. Hobart wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a villain either. The crew that had pursued Oren was still out there, still operating, likely targeting another driver on another highway. The highway patrol was doing their best, but they were always a step behind. And Oren was just one driver in a system that had too many vulnerabilities and not enough oversight. His phone buzzed with a text from dispatch. "Excellent work on the delivery. Client is very pleased. Got another load for you, Omaha to Portland. Picks up Monday morning. Premium rate interested?" Oren stared at the message. Portland meant going back through Wyoming again, back through the corridor where all of this had happened. He could say no, could refuse, could ask for different routes for the rest of his career. But that would mean letting fear dictate his decisions, would mean giving up on segments of the country that were part of his livelihood. He typed his response slowly. "Yes, I'll take it. But I want full briefings on any known threats in that corridor, and I want a confirmation that Highway Patrol will be monitoring the route." Dispatch agreed immediately, understanding more than Oren expected. The FBI agent called the next morning, a woman named Special Agent Cordova, who spent 2 hours going through every detail of both incidents. She told Oren that his information had helped identify 2 of the vehicles and 1 of the crew members. Arrests were being planned, warrants were being prepared. It would take time, but progress was being made. When the call ended, Agent Cordova said something that stuck with Oren. "You did everything right, Mr. Kincaid. You trusted your instincts, you called for help. You didn't let yourself get isolated. But I want you to understand something. The instincts that kept you safe also created a situation where you misjudged someone who was trying to help you. That's the cost of vigilance. Sometimes it makes you see threats where none exist. The key is learning to live with that ambiguity, to accept that you'll make mistakes, and to adjust your understanding when new information becomes available. Orrin thought about that a lot over the following months. He ran the Wyoming corridor again, multiple times, and each time he passed mile marker 235, he thought about Hobart Lyle working his ranch, living under a cloud of suspicion, helping law enforcement track criminals who'd used his property. He thought about Avis at the way station, doing her job, trying to protect drivers with the information she had. He thought about Pearl, whose bitterness had poisoned her judgment, but whose pain had been real. And he thought about himself, about the choices he'd made, about the nights he'd lost sleep worrying about threats that turned out to be different from what he'd feared. The road was still dangerous. Crews were still out there hunting for vulnerabilities. But the danger was more complex than any simple story of good guys and bad guys could capture. It was layered, ambiguous, requiring constant recalibration of trust and suspicion, of caution and courage. Orrin never forgot that 6 months of uncertainty, that period when he'd lived in fear of someone who'd been trying to protect him. But he also never forgot the lessons it taught him about the complexity of human motivation, about how people could be trying to help and still look threatening, about how partial information created narratives that felt true but weren't complete. The road had always been a teacher, harsh and unforgiving, but generous with its lessons to those who paid attention. And Orrin paid attention. Every mile, every load, every choice. Because that was what survival required. Not certainty, which was impossible, but the willingness to act despite uncertainty, to trust despite doubt, and to keep moving forward even when you couldn't see clearly where the road would lead.